The story begins in a castle in the kingdom of Achilles, where the emperor held a document informing him of the surrender of the principality of Side. Proudly, he said, expanding past Alit's iron mines was a dream even his father never achieved, then turned to Count Margrave and praised his good work. He added that this was a fitting time to consider what reward to give him, then asked the duke whether his heir had passed marriageable age because of the war. Surprised, the duke stayed silent as the emperor said the royal family must take responsibility and asked how old he was this year. The duke answered, 24 years old, your majesty. The emperor studied his son and said the age was perfect. Smiling, he announced the reward, his beloved sister, a woman he wouldn't mind becoming the young man's favorite. Hearing that, the duke's voice turned cold with concern. A hidden princess no one had ever seen. Everyone believed she was dead. The duke asked if he was really offering that princess. The emperor said this would be the first time everyone saw her. When the servants opened the door, a woman appeared, and everyone was stunned by her appearance, while the emperor declared she was the princess of the kingdom of Achilles, the sister he loved most of all, Miss Achille. When Eric Cladnir saw her, he was shocked. The appearance of Missa was nothing like a princess. The emperor looked at her, said she was very shy, and told her to come to him. Missa tried to speak but couldn't, then tried to walk to him, lost her balance, and fell forward. No one said a word as she lay on the floor. The emperor only smiled and said the princess was a little indisposed, asking everyone to be patient. Then he ordered Missa to get up at once. Nervous, the count said it was an honor for the family to receive the noble princess, though to him she looked more like a slave. The count's son Cladnir swore no one would insult the emperor or the princess, and that he would make sure not to disappoint him. Satisfied, the emperor said that was right, the princess would be his wife, then told them to come closer and take a better look. Cladnir didn't hesitate and immediately stepped forward. When he reached Missa, he knelt before her and looked at her. Then he offered his hand to help her up and said it was an honor to receive the princess. But at that moment, Missa pulled her hand away, leaving Cladnir completely confused. Then he noticed something. That expression was the look of someone who had seen something truly terrible, as if being touched frightened her. The emperor gestured for her to stop treating her future husband that way and called her over. Missa immediately went to her brother and knelt beside him. He stroked her head, said she'd been rude, and that she must apologize. Seeing all this, Cladnir said nothing. After meeting the king, Count Margrave's family returned home. Margrave and his wife sat in the carriage, silently thinking about what had just happened. He was clearly not happy at all to receive this marriage contract. After the long war, the real hero was clearly Cladnir, and the emperor must resent that. This marriage was his way of binding the family. Back at his castle, the count exploded, shouting that the price of their loyalty was an idiotic princess who didn't even know how to speak. Cladnir stayed thoughtful. He knew he couldn't refuse the imperial decree. This arranged marriage was inevitable, even if it was an unwanted one. As the young Duke of Cladnir, it was something he had to do. His cousin Barik asked if that meant the match with the Crispin family, but before he could finish, the count furiously said of course it was cancelled. He couldn't understand that mad tyrant. Then he turned to his wife Taliesin and asked if she was angry too, but she was lost in thought, remembering what happened earlier. 2 servants from the imperial palace had told her the princess wasn't allowed to use a room alone. The duchess answered that a passage connected the 2 rooms, but they refused. She had seen the princess's condition herself. If the princess fainted at night, it would be a huge problem, and the emperor would be furious. Thinking it over, she said she would hire attendants. But one servant asked if she meant to entrust the princess's body to hired help, and the other added that if so, the emperor would be furious. Remembering all that, the count angrily said Cladnir would have to take care of the princess himself. How dare the emperor do this to the heir of Cladnir? The night was full of resentment and bitterness, but Cladnir hardly seemed to care. The next day, news spread of the noble princess wedding. The heroic knight who had returned victorious from war, and people, bored by the long conflict, smiled happily. From the carriage, Cladnir looked at them and thought their excitement made sense because they knew nothing. To them, this was just a fairy tale. In the castle where the wedding of the 2 would take place, everyone was complaining. They hadn't expected the princess to look like that. What does she even look like? One woman started to mention rumors, then suddenly went quiet when she saw the count and his wife approaching. As soon as he entered, a soldier came over and reported that the emperor could not attend the wedding ceremony. At least the princess had arrived safely. The count clenched his fists. It seemed the emperor meant to make a fool of him until the end. Then a voice announced the wedding was about to begin and asked everyone to take their places. The priest then asked the bride and groom to come up to the podium. At that moment, Cladnir, handsome and dressed in white with gold details, walked to the altar. A moment later, the door opened again, and Missa entered before everyone's eyes. The second they saw her, the rumors started up again. Is she unwell? Why does she look drunk? She can't even walk properly. But Cladnir ignored the whispers and waited quietly at the altar. Once they were both there, the priest announced the groom was Eric Cladnir, and the bride Missa Akil then declared them partners for the rest of their lives under the watchful eye of God, and said he could kiss the bride now. He kissed her gently, and thankfully, Missa didn't recoil in fear the way she had when she first met Cladnir for the first time. After the ceremony, the 2 returned to the castle. Before Cladnir entered the room, one servant warned him not to hurt the princess on their wedding night. Another said they would return in the morning for proof they had spent the night together. He stayed silent a moment, then said he understood, and entered coldly. Inside, Cladnir found Missa tied to the bed. The sight frightened him, and he slowly moved closer. Her eyes looked lifeless. After a moment, Cladnir removed his blouse and went to the bed, still watching her. Then he noticed several bottles beside it. He wondered if it was a sedative. There was enough there to put down a horse. He hadn't expected them to drug someone already about to starve to death. Even prisoners of war weren't treated like this. Cladnir wondered who could do something so horrible. Furious, he assumed it came on orders from the emperor. It was unbelievable. He carefully began untying her, saying she must be freezing because her body temperature had dropped a lot. Once she was free, Cladnir gently asked if she was all right, though he knew there was no way she could be after being treated like that. He also noticed her wrists were still bound and must be hurting, so he undid the restraints. Afterward, Cladnir saw the tips of Misa's fingers had turned dark red from being tied so long. Left that way, it could become a serious problem. Looking at the weak princess sitting on the bed, Cladnir knew he had no choice. Holding the bedside table, he told her he was going to lie on the blanket for a moment and asked her not to be afraid. After lying down, Cladnir introduced himself. He was Cladnir of the Cladnir family, 24 years old, with no brother. He once had a younger brother, but she died in an accident while still young. During the war, he had lived on the border with the city palace. Today, the princess had married him. When he finished, he looked at her in silence, wondering if she even understood. But there was no other way to explain the situation. Cladnir took Misa's cold hand and said winters on the border were brutal, and freezing always starts at the ends. The most important thing was getting the blood moving again, and as he spoke, he rubbed her cold hand. After a while, Princess Misa fell asleep. Cladnir was relieved to see she seemed better. Her skin color had returned, and after one night of rest, she should improve. Now he needed proof of the wedding night to protect her. Looking around the room, he decided the 2 crystal glasses on the table should work. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, the emperor's servants arrived. Cladnir handed over a blanket as proof of the night he had forged the night before. The 2 servants examined it and said they would pass it on to the priest. One then moved toward the room and said she was going to start dressing the princess. But as she approached the door, Cladnir quickly stopped her, telling her to wait because the princess still hadn't woken up and asking her to do it later. After hearing that, they turned around and left. Once they were gone, Cladnir opened the door and went inside. The moment he entered, he heard strange noises. He looked to the side at once and saw the princess chewing on the blanket like it was food. Eric panicked and quickly told her it wasn't something to eat, but she kept biting it anyway. He realized she must be starving. While she kept chewing the blanket, Eric asked her to wait a moment. He brought some bread and offered it to the princess, asking if she wanted to eat. The second she saw the bread in Eric's hand, her eyes lit up and she quickly snatched it from him. That made him deeply sad, but when he saw the gentle look on her face as she ate the bread, Eric couldn't help smiling. He told her he was glad she liked it. Once she finished, Eric returned to his castle with the princess, though the 2 servants escorting her held her tightly. The Duke clearly disliked the sight but still welcomed them and wondered how this would end. He told them to rest first, since they must be exhausted. Then Nisa suddenly tried to climb the bear statue in the garden as the servants shouted that it was dangerous. Eric caught her by the neck, while the Duke clenched his fists in anger. Unable to accept a reward like this, he turned and walked away. Seeing his father react that way, Eric had no idea how to fix the situation. Just then, a servant came over and offered to take care of the princess, saying he must be tired. Eric refused, said everything was fine, and told them to take the luggage and get some rest. Hearing that, they smiled faintly and agreed. After the 2 servants left, Eric called over a family servant and gave instructions. He said the princess was now part of his family, and since her health was poor, they should take special care when serving her. The servant bowed and promised the lady would not feel uncomfortable. Then they all headed toward the mansion, while the Duchess followed behind, quietly watching everything unfold and feeling uneasy. Later, in the dining room, they all sat down for dinner. The 2 servants stayed as well, since they never leave the princess's side. Eric said he would handle his wife's meal himself and asked them to step back. They refused, explaining that the princess often has accidents while eating. Uncomfortable, Eric asked if there was anything she especially liked or disliked. They answered that no, she eats everything. After that, Eric cut a piece of meat and offered it to Misa, asking if she wanted to try it. She took the piece and ate while staring at him. Without looking away, Eric watched every little change in Misa's face. But as she chewed contentedly, she suddenly spat meat onto his face, then panicked and smashed all the dishes in front of her. Worried, he kept trying to calm her down. He held her while the 2 servants covered their mouths and laughed at the scene. Eric turned and ordered them to take his wife for a bath because he had been dirtied. They obeyed, though their faces clearly showed they disliked the order. Once they took Miso away, the family meal turned grim. The Count, already watching everything, was furious. He flashed the Duchess a secret sign asking whether they should leave the princess alive. The lady answered with a dark smile. If he killed her, they would all die. Meanwhile, Eric stayed silent, thinking about his wife's behavior. In their land, the kingdom of Achilles, there are 3 great families known as the 3 pillars. First is the Salaka family, which helped found the kingdom. Second is the Crispin family, which protects internal security. And third is the Cladnir family, which guards external security. Together, the 3 hold enormous power over the military and security of the kingdom. The previous emperor took 3 queens from those 3 families. The first queen, daughter of the Duke of Salakesa, bore a prince, the tyrant Marmalik II, who abandoned his duties and imposed absolute monarchy under the excuse of restoring imperial power. He wiped out the Salakesa family with his own hands. Still unsatisfied, he turned his oppression on the other 2 families as well. Unable to endure it, they decided to join forces. They secretly arranged a marriage between their heirs, planning to spark a rebellion once the war ended. But things did not go as planned. The Cladnir family earned undeniable glory in the war, winning the sympathy of people worn down by the emperor's tyranny, and there was no way for him to ignore that. The count clenched his right hand and bitterly said the reward for all of it was a mentally broken woman who couldn't even eat properly. The Duchess replied that the princess had once been healthy, but after watching the people of the kingdom die slowly, she became like this. Even so, the count still wasn't calm. He turned to Eric and said that this morning, some vassals suggested Ambric should be made heir. He added that Marcus Crispin said if they truly wanted an heir, others also thought changing the successor would be wise. Do you know what that means? It means your place has become secure because of this mad woman. Eric said nothing for a long time. Then he asked if Grand Duke Gale was still hesitating. The Duke answered that he too was a weakling. The king's cousin, Grand Duke Gale, besides the princess, was the only royal still alive and a crucial figure for giving legitimacy to the revolt. But after an accident left him incapacitated, he could no longer face the outside world and lived almost like a forgotten name. The more the count thought about it, the angrier he became, until he slammed the table and said nothing works. Then he stormed out. As she poured wine into her cup, the Duchess asked what Eric thought about uniting the two families through marriage. He answered that from the start, joining the families through marriage had been impossible. Now that the emperor was watching closely, there was no reason to draw attention by holding a wedding ceremony. It was still unclear who would inherit the throne. It could take years to persuade the nobles, and no one knew how much longer the marquise's daughter could stay single. Taliesin agreed. She said staying on the battlefield too long can make a person's politics rigid, when even the young can see that everyone is focused only on trying to kill the princess. Eric replied that for now, it was better to watch the situation. She said it was fine not to be criticized by the emperor's servants, but warned him not to fall in love with the princess. That warning left Eric visibly unsettled. After a pause, she said nothing is more shallow than a man's feelings. Since he was her son, she expected nothing more. If it was only temporary passion, he shouldn't waste love from the beginning. What she meant was simple. He must not deceive that child. That night, Eric returned to his room. As he walked, he wondered whether his mother thought it would be better to get rid of the princess. Then the images from the day before came back to him, her body covered in wounds and the hand that had turned dark red from the cold. He still remembered how peaceful she looked when she fell asleep. She had been so beautiful. Then he heard voices from the room. The servants were telling the princess to get into bed quickly because the young duke would arrive soon. Inside, they were trying to force her to lie down, but she refused to settle. One servant remarked that since she had eaten so much, she still had plenty of strength. They talked as if no one else were there. One asked if the other had seen everyone's expressions earlier, and the other said, of course it had been beyond words. So Eric cut them off and told them to leave his wife to his care. It was obvious how the princess had been treated until now. He looked at them and ordered both to leave the room. The servant's face hardened. She clearly did not want to go, but she had no choice except to obey. After they left, Eric looked thoughtfully at Misa. She sat there quietly, neither speaking nor causing trouble like before. Seeing her like that, he said she seemed to be in a good mood today. Sitting beside her, Eric explained that this was a mansion in the capital. From now on, Misa would have to travel between here and Cladiz, her territory. Then he asked whether anything made her uncomfortable there. She only sat still, stroking her hair, while Eric thought that when he entered, it had seemed like they made eye contact, but she lost interest almost at once. He looked over her clothes and wondered if this was all the princess had to wear. It looked like a prisoner's uniform. But while he was staring, Misa suddenly turned, and her beautiful expression made Eric freeze for a few seconds, unable to pull his eyes away. While he was still stunned, Misa stepped closer and spat in Eric's face, leaving him completely speechless. Me, Ruby, I just thought it was adorable and laughed a lot. Anyway, back to the story. After a moment, he wiped his face and told her she mustn't spit on people's faces. Then he asked her to rest first, because he still had work left to finish before he could sleep. But inside, he wondered what on earth he was doing. Then he turned to leave, saying that if she needed anything, she could call him. Misa stayed silent, watching him go. A few hours later, the two of them slept peacefully, until a sudden sound from outside jolted Misa awake. Frightened, she couldn't fall asleep again. The next morning at breakfast, Eric asked with concern whether she had felt uncomfortable sleeping last night, but she ignored him and kept eating the piece of bread in her hand. Eric studied her strange expression. Her complexion looked worse than usual. Yesterday, before bed, she had looked fine. He told her that even without an appetite, she still needed to eat well to keep up her strength. At least she should. Eric told Misa that even without an appetite, she had to eat at least a little. But for some reason, she suddenly got excited, slapped the table, and grabbed the plate in front of her. Using her hands, she picked up each piece and stuffed it into her mouth, chewing slowly. Eric just stared at Misa, completely unsure what to do. A few days passed after Eric and the princess's wedding, and the mood in the mansion shifted a little. Today, Eric went to his camp. Everyone greeted him respectfully, but from their faces, it was obvious they all had something to say. A heavy mood hung over the entire mansion. Eric immediately asked if they had finished today's training and why they were just standing around. Hearing that, everyone nervously shook their heads, said no, and went back to training. At some point, Count Margrave Clydnir started avoiding family meals, and Duchess Clydnir openly showed her displeasure at her husband's inability to control his emotions and the vassals following the Clydnir family. Everyone seemed confused. Still, no one dared complain about Eric, the manager, because he stayed calm and composed, like nothing had happened. After training, Eric returned to the palace and asked about his wife. A guard respectfully replied that after a morning walk, she was now in the maid's workroom. Wiping away sweat, Eric asked why she went there every day. In the maid's workplace, they chatted cheerfully, and in the middle of them, Princess Misa was fast asleep. They spoke at full volume, but she looked completely comfortable and slept so deeply she never woke up. One maid said that no matter how clean they were still the clothes they wore. Another pointed at Misa's hair, brighter than gold, and called her so cute, like a pure white cat she had once seen. While they admired Princess Misa's beauty, Eric came through the door and asked if the other two had left again. The maids respectfully answered that they had, but said they had taken good care of the young lady, and told him she was here alone. Eric picked her up, told everyone to keep up the good work, and said he'd take care of his wife now. Then he left, carrying her through a long quiet corridor to his room. Misa was still sleeping soundly until her eyes suddenly opened and she no longer wanted to rest in Eric's arms. Seeing her struggle, he asked her for one favor: wait until he could put her on the bed or she might fall and get hurt. After some effort, he managed to lay Misa down in bed. Her strange behavior left him speechless. After several days of watching the princess, Eric felt she didn't like him much. It seemed she only saw him as a way to get around. He stood there watching her for a long time and then noticed a strand of wool still caught in Misa's hair. He reached out to remove it, but Misa reacted so strongly that Eric hesitated for a moment. He gently said he didn't mean to scare her, he just wanted to take the strand of wool caught in her hair. Once he removed it, he thought back to her reaction. She had clearly been frightened. Then Misa lifted her face and gave him a stunned look, her eyes mysterious and expressive. Eric remembered what the maid had said earlier. Once she had seen a pure white cat like that, and suddenly Eric cried out, overwhelmed by the princess's beauty. That night in the castle, Misa slept peacefully while Eric handled documents. He read the report he'd ordered one of his assistants to investigate. It was about the palace maids, Maleka and Deal. They kept leaving the princess with the other maids and disappeared whenever they had the chance, which definitely made it seem like they were up to something. Eric held his head. Besides that, he was also worried about feeding the residents of the territory. Looking closely at the letter in his hand, he realized he had far too much to worry about. The letter confirmed that Count Margrave was cheating on the Duchess with a girl from a house in the suburbs. Eric remembered when his father suddenly brought up an engagement between the Crispin family and the Cladnier family. Back then, he was the only one who doubted it. In a way, that was natural. His father's proposal wasn't bad for the vassals and knights, but Eric still couldn't shake his unease. From that day on, he secretly watched what was happening around his father. After a long time, he uncovered the Count's secret. A certain hostess from a bar often visited his father's room. It was the first time he had seen that side of his father, and it left a bitter taste. On the battlefield, where life and death were constant, he couldn't dwell on it. He investigated whether the woman had some deeper motive, but found nothing unusual, so he tried to cover it up and acted like he alone knew. But after the war ended, his father brought the woman here and even told his right-hand man it was Bannon who would take her as his second wife, devoting himself to her completely. With no other choice, Eric sent his mother a letter with evidence. The reply came through the maid Jill. His mother was too tired and too old to care anymore, and if he wanted to give himself to another woman, so be it. In fact, she said it was easier not to see him every night anymore. If he had been a nobleman, spreading the news would have been easier, but it was difficult because the woman had no powerful backing. Aside from the occasional visits from the former captain who used to bathe at the suburban house, there was absolutely no visitor. Eric leaned his head back and whispered tiredly. To him, his mother's reaction wasn't strange. From the start, if you looked closely, the two had been more like partners building a family than lovers. Lost in thought, Eric turned and saw Misa sitting up in bed, looking around in confusion. When she started walking toward him, he asked with concern if he had woken her, if she couldn't sleep anymore, or if she needed anything. But Misa ignored him, walked straight to where Eric sat, and suddenly put her hand on his shoulder before climbing right onto his lap. The move left Eric stunned. Misa reached for the papers spread across the table, so Eric picked one up and showed it to her, asking if she was curious, though it probably wasn't very interesting. When she tore one of the cards, he thought to himself that the princess, who had always subtly avoided him, now seemed more comfortable around him, and that made him unexpectedly happy. Watching her focus on that particular document, he realized he hadn't thought much about it before because of all the chaos and his resentment toward the emperor. But now a new feeling took hold when he remembered she was the person he'd spend the rest of his life with. When he first came into contact with knighthood as a child, those words filled him with both pride and responsibility. Not long after, though, reality forced him awake from that sweet dream. No matter how many noble words people use, in the end, shedding blood for the family is really just entertainment for the next generation. So he never had any particular hopes for the woman who would become his wife. He didn't even mind if she liked tearing paper to pieces like this. Once he accepted his position and duty as the family's heir, he stopped expecting much from his relationships with women. Then Misa suddenly became interested in a letter, and just as she reached for the document, Eric quickly stopped her and gently told her to stop. He picked up the document and said she couldn't tear this one because he hadn't read it yet. But Misa kept staring at that document with anxious eyes. He lifted it higher and she kept trying to grab it. The next morning, the Duchess was sitting on a sofa when her personal servant asked whether she should have a large fireplace prepared separately in the stove for this year's recital. Looking at the letter in her hand, the Duchess said a small fireplace would be better prepared in advance, since this year seemed colder than usual. But suddenly, the princess appeared in front of her, stumbled, fell to the floor, and then, out of nowhere, started to sleep. Looking at her lying there, the Duchess commented that the princess had come, which was unusual. She had heard the princess was always with her servants, but today she had come to her instead. Jill, standing beside the Duchess, pointed out that she kept calling her princess like a stranger. The Duchess replied that she still didn't know how to address her, so she asked the imperial servant Dari what she should call the princess, since she didn't know much about palace etiquette. The servant either couldn't answer or didn't want to, and the Duchess realized that as expected they were not only useless but not even making the slightest effort to do well. Then Jill mentioned that something similar had happened 3 generations ago. Back then, the head and wife of the Edvar family called the princess by her name. The Duchess asked if she should do the same, saying she had heard the princess's noble name was Misa, so she called the princess Misa. The moment someone said her name, the princess lying on the floor looked up. Then she suddenly got up, which even the Duchess found strange. But a second later, Misa smiled at her so brightly that the Duchess smiled too. Soon after, Misa went right back to sleep, and Duchess Taliesa said Misa was a very beautiful name that suited her well. The servant commented that the princess seemed to really like her, then asked whether she could have her take care of her until dinner. Taliesa answered yes with a hand gesture. At that, the servant, looking a little nervous, apologized and withdrew. The two watched her leave the room, and Jill let out a relieved breath, saying it wasn't easy. Even with a single title, you never know what they might criticize. Jill said she'd heard the servant stays busy all day, carefully preparing the princess's bath, yet is never seen around the mansion. The Duchess guessed there must be a reason for their laziness, but since they don't know what they'll use against them, they have to match their pace. Jill agreed that worried her most. Pressing a hand to her head, the Duchess asked for her headache medicine. A little later, a maid brought it, and Jill asked if it was really the medicine the Duchess usually took. The maid said yes, it was what she'd found beside the bed. Jill turned toward her mistress and saw Misa sitting at her feet. Looking at the princess, she said she'd leave the headache medicine on the table. It struck her as strange. The Duchess almost never let anyone rest against her knee like that. Then she asked if everything was all right, saying that if the pain was severe, they should call a doctor. Instead, the Duchess asked whether the princess was 20 years old, and her servant confirmed it. Taliesa said that explained it. She'd heard Misa had watched more than half the royal family be brutally massacred as a child. Stroking the princess's head, the Duchess said Misa must have suffered too much to bear it sanely, and even now people keep probing those wounds. The servant froze, watching her mistress say the princess was a pitiful girl, such a beautiful one too. Her eyes were lovely, her face well-shaped, she only needed to be fed properly. Jill wondered since when her lady noticed things like that, but the Duchess went on, saying Misa's hair was always so messy she couldn't see her face clearly. Just then, Misa turned to look at Jill, who had been studying her so closely. The servant thought those eyes seemed familiar, then it hit her, but that couldn't be right. Was the Duchess seeing that child whenever she looked at the princess? Meanwhile, Taliesa told Misa her nails needed trimming and her hair brushing. Elsewhere, a servant informed Eric that the princess had spent the whole morning with his mother, and after thanking him, Eric decided to go see for himself. On the way, he heard someone begging the lady not to do it. Jill was pleading to handle Misa's nails, but the Duchess refused. She said it was better if she did it herself, since another hand might frighten Misa. Eric entered stunned and asked what they were doing. His mother was holding scissors, trying to cut Misa's toenails. Alarmed, he asked again what she thought she was doing. Taliesa calmly said she was trimming them. If they left them like that, Misa would be uncomfortable walking. Eric could hardly believe his mother was touching the girl's feet. His mother barely showed even slight sympathy to anyone. She wasn't the kind of woman who'd do this. Hadn't she always been rational and cold, even with her own son? Yet now she looked at the princess with impossible tenderness. The only time he'd seen that expression before was when her younger sister Rose was still alive. Maybe she had already grown fond of Misa because she reminded her of little Rose. He stepped in and asked for the scissors so he could do it. The Duchess said it was fine, she could finish on her own, but Eric insisted and took the scissors to do the job himself. What worried him was the memory of how his mother had been on Rose's last day. Even as he intervened, he wondered whether he was doing the right thing, whether it was all right to leave her like this. Eric sat down and carefully began cutting Misa's toenails. She noticed someone else had taken over caring for her, but thankfully she stayed calm. It even looked like Misa was about to say something. Then Eric noticed her expression. Misa looked unhappy, and he worried she was uncomfortable. Then he spotted cookies on the table and quickly handed one to her. Everyone stared, but after eating the cookie, the princess seemed to settle down. Eric asked what Jill had just done, and she explained that Misa had seemed upset. Earlier, when the lady brushed her hair, she made a huge fuss, but the moment they put candy in her mouth, she went quiet. Apparently, the princess liked sweets. The Duchess wondered how Misa could eat with such a stiff little mouth. Eric looked at his mother as she added that it was good to see the princess eating well. That night at the castle, Eric and Misa ate dinner together. As he fed her, he kept wondering what exactly his mother had seen in the princess that reminded her of Rose. The only similarity was their eye color, but if that were enough, his cousin Ambric should have received the same affection, and he never had. Eric still couldn't grasp what was going on. A butler brought in the meal and apologized, saying the grilled quail had taken longer than expected. Eric told him to set it down and leave, and the butler immediately did. Looking at Misa, Eric remembered she'd become much more docile after eating sweets earlier, but suddenly she grew uneasy and very frightened. Worried, Eric asked if something was wrong. When he noticed her shrinking away from the grilled quail, he remembered the imperial servants had claimed she ate everything, but that was clearly a lie. He removed the dish and had a servant take it away, then turned back to Misa, wondering what had happened. Had she once had a bad experience with quail? The next morning, the maids asked the princess to lie on the sheets because the floor was cold, but she showed no intention of moving and just played with a ball of yarn. One maid came closer and told her the floor was cold and hard, and she should lie on something soft. Misa rolled over and stopped on the sheets while the maid kept talking to her. The others said she was talking to herself since the princess never answered. Another said Misa simply didn't understand, which was very strange. One maid said she'd heard the princess's feet never touched the ground because Master Eric carried her in his arms everywhere. A younger maid said it would be better to dress her in better clothes, but since she kept lying on the floor, they got dirty so easily, that was probably why she only wore that one. Then someone said if dirt was the problem, they could make a bath for her, and the maids excitedly got to work. In the training yard, everyone was practicing hard. Eric glanced at the sky and said it was already past lunch. He wondered if Misa had eaten well, since she'd seemed in a bad mood that morning. After training, he headed back, thinking he probably wasn't as entertaining as the maids. When he asked after her day, he learned the princess had fallen into the river and was now in the maid's room. Eric asked how it happened, and was told she fell while watching fish in the stream on the way to the chapel with the Duchess. That eased him a little. If she'd been with his mother, it probably hadn't been very dangerous. At least for all the chaos, she'd been distracted all day. A maid added that the princess didn't seem to like the chapel much, and Eric said maybe it was just boring for his wife. She'd probably had to sit there a long time. Misa had followed obediently when the Duchess took her, but once they arrived she started complaining right at the entrance, so she stayed outside with the maids until the Duchess came back. Hearing about her day, Eric wondered if she'd have enjoyed it more with sweets like yesterday. He turned to the maid and told her to keep sweets on the table every day from now on. She bowed and promised she would. At dinner, Misa waited for Eric to feed her. He noted that today she was eating very well. It was a relief. He hoped she'd recover her strength soon. Watching her happily eat, he thought maybe she'd just been in a bad mood the day before. He urged her to eat vegetables too, not just meat, but when he tried to offer a piece, some food slipped onto the tablecloth. Eric quickly reached for it, but the piece landed in a very awkward spot. Looking at her, he apologized for a moment and gently picked the piece off her clothes. As she watched closely, she tried to eat it, but he moved the rest of the food away. Eric said he'd cut her another piece. That one wasn't for eating. But Misa ignored him and stubbornly tried to get it, then suddenly bit Eric's finger along with the piece of food. He froze for a moment, staring as she tried to eat his finger too. Then he jerked his hand back, shaken by what had just happened. Misa looked surprised that he'd pulled away, and immediately got upset with him for it. She grabbed the dinner tablecloth and yanked with all her strength, sending food everywhere. The maid outside opened the door at the crash of breaking plates. Peeking in, she found the princess with a plate on her head, food scattered across the room, and Eric silently staring at his hand. As she cleared the table for bath time, she wondered why Master Eric never got tired of meals with the princess. When he went to bed, he still couldn't sleep. His thoughts were a mess as he remembered the warm touch on his fingers. He could still feel the warmth of her lips. She was his wife, but mentally she seemed like a child. Maybe she didn't even know he was her husband. Lost in thought, he covered his embarrassed face with his hand. The next day, Misa lay against the Duchess's neck while Taliesa said the recital would be held in this room. And with so many people there, she worried Misa would be afraid. Eric asked if she wasn't exaggerating a little. She replied that everyone was looking for trouble between them, so they had to show that they get along. It's called a poetic reading, which sounds harmless, but really it's where like-minded noble families meet each month to trade views on the imperial city and its corrupt families. Since the Cladnier family hosted it, the stove had been packed with workers for days, getting everything ready for the event. The Marquis Crispin's wife and their only daughter, Lakani, were coming too. Since this was their first meeting after the broken engagement, everyone was secretly watching, knowing it would be painfully awkward. The lady then asked Misa if she wanted to see the stove before it was finished. At the same time, Eric asked Misa whether she'd had fun today. The Duchess smiled and teased that he sounded like a father checking on the daughter he left with a nanny, then said yes. Misa had enjoyed herself a lot today. She asked if Eric wanted to come see the stove with them, but he refused. He still had work to finish and had only come to make sure Misa was all right, though he said he'd go later after he was done. At the stove where the event would be held, employees were busy everywhere. Misa seemed to love it and started running all around. When Eric saw her earlier, she had looked like a little girl or a kitten, but watching her stare around in wonder eased him. She always seemed tense, and now at least a little she had relaxed. One employee came up to the princess carrying a bird in a cage and cheerfully asked whether her lady had come to see the stove. The bird stared at the princess strangely as the maid added that they were always waiting for her in the maid's room, but never knew when she'd actually show up. Then Misa's expression slowly changed as she looked at the bird. Fear filled her eyes, and it dragged her back to that terrible night when the tyrant emperor massacred her family. In her panic, she heard the bird speak in a frightening voice. "Misa, I think our mother did something wrong. No matter how bad she is, she'd always scold us if we were wrong, so maybe now our mother has been silenced." Misa screamed as the terror returned. The memory overwhelmed her, and she dropped to the ground, screaming even louder. The workers just stared, unable to understand what was happening. Hearing the scream, the Duchess whipped around, while Eric ran to Misa in desperation, trying to calm her down. He held her and asked if she was all right. What happened? The maid could only say she didn't know. Misa had screamed all at once. Misa threw herself into Eric's arms and clung to him, trembling violently. Eric still had no idea what was going on when one of the imperial servants said she must have panicked at the bird. Apparently, the princess was afraid of birds. The maid with the cage quickly moved it out of the princess's sight. Furious, the Duchess asked why no one had mentioned that before, and if they weren't going to warn them, why dress the princess and let her come there at all? With an ugly look, the maid answered that she bathed and dressed the princess every day. So why was the Duchess being so rude just because she hadn't said anything? Hearing that, Adil was left speechless. The Duchess said nothing either, and simply went quiet, but her face made it clear she was not pleased. Eric saw at once that his mother was furious, but when he looked back, Misa was crying in his arms, so he decided to take his wife somewhere else and calm her down. Lifting her into his arms, he carried her away from the stove. Misa was still shaking and crying, and he wondered if this was why she never wanted to eat grilled codorna. Looking at her, Eric promised there would be no more birds on the table in the future, and he'd also have the light removed from the stove. As they walked, Misa suddenly noticed the garden. Seeing that, he asked if she wanted to go there, though maybe a bird could appear. He wondered whether she'd once been trapped with a bird in a cage back at the imperial mansion after he married her. Misa spent every day inside that mansion, except when her mother took her to the chapel. Eric sat on a swing with the princess in his lap and told her not to worry, just relax. He wiped away her tears and said that if a bird showed up, he'd scare it off at once, and if she fell asleep, he'd carry her back to her room. Misa kept her eyes on Eric, feeling safe in his arms. Little by little, her eyelids drooped, and then she fell asleep. Just then, Ambrick arrived and asked if Eric was out walking with his wife, adding that they looked good together. He came closer and asked if she was asleep. Eric answered briefly and tried to leave, but Ambrick didn't let it drop. He asked if Eric was worried she'd wake up, then said the rumors about them had spread so far they'd even reached his house. Eric immediately asked who had started it this time. With Eric's uncle moving collateral relatives around to place his son Ambrick at the head of the family, rumors about the matriarch's line couldn't be ignored. Ambrick said it came from a servant named Bina, a redhead from the capital. She was supposedly a new maid, one of those servants who drift everywhere. Ambrick was kind by nature and had no interest in leading the family. The two had built trust on the battlefield, trading words that might have been their last. Eric thanked him and said he owed him one. Ambrick sat on the grass and said that was why these past few days had been pretty fun. Then he asked what else was going on. Was Eric really in love with his wife? He'd even heard Eric had cut her toenails. Eric said he only did that because he couldn't just sit there and watch his mother handle those things. Ambrick said maybe so, but after seeing him today, it seemed excessive. That made Eric ask what exactly he meant by that. Ambrick said he'd heard the princess's feet never touched the ground, and now people were saying her husband never let his arms rest. Eric answered that her legs weren't well that day, and besides, he didn't really know what he was doing. Was he supposed to drag her the way the imperial servants had during the wedding ceremony? Could Ambrick do that to his wife? Ambrick said no, not even close, but he still didn't understand. At first he thought Eric's act to fool the king was impressive, but now no one was watching. Pointing at him, he asked why he was still acting like that. "You're going to leave this woman, right?" Eric snapped and told him to shut up, but Ambrick said he asked because he truly didn't know what Eric was thinking. The smartest move would be to get rid of her quickly, especially since he had been about to marry Lacani Crispin. Eric told him to stop, then said it didn't matter who entered the house as long as it helped the family. Now that Misa was there, the king would leave them alone for a while, and there was no greater advantage right now. It had been inevitable, the right choice, and Misa herself knew nothing. But now she was sitting on his lap, and he had no idea how she'd been treated before. Did they really need to make her even more miserable? Everyone treated the princess like a plague, and he fell silent, thinking about what she might have gone through. A few days later, the poetry reading began. One by one, lovers of families tied to the Cladnir family arrived at the stove, including the mother and daughter of the Crispin family. Once everyone had taken their seats, Eric and Misa appeared as well, exchanging brief greetings despite the dozens of curious eyes on them. The tension between the Crispins and the Cladnirs made the room even more uncomfortable. Everyone pretended otherwise, but all were watching. Eric settled Misa on his lap and announced that his wife wasn't feeling well, so he would not stay. He hoped they would enjoy the gathering. With that, Eric picked up Misa and left the room. Lacani only watched in silence as he carried the princess away. Then she followed him and asked him to wait a moment. Eric asked what she wanted, and she said she only needed to speak to him briefly. He asked whether it was wise for her to be walking alone. As they spoke, someone hid behind the trees, listening. Lacani said it would be quick because there wasn't much time, then asked him not to have children with the princess. Eric froze in surprise. Silence fell between them as they stared at each other. Then she said goodbye and threw away the broom she had been holding. Later, in a carriage, the Duchess Crispin asked if she had gotten rid of the broom properly and whether she'd spoken to him about children. Lacani said yes. Her mother said she had seen the two of them embracing and looking far too happy. It was disgusting. She added that Lacani was the kind of girl men would like, with her beautiful face and sweet smile. She should get into that house. Only then would mother and daughter receive the treatment they had never had before. Lacani Crispin had been raised to bear heirs and taught only the virtues of becoming a family's lady. As her mother talked, she silently stared at her calloused hand. That night, Eric was working in his room, his head crowded with problems lately, mostly because of his father, who was so consumed by state affairs, he had nearly neglected the family's own. As a result, Eric was suddenly handling most family matters alone. The hardest issue was the aftermath of the Long War. The territory had lost huge numbers of people and property, and now the population didn't have enough food to survive the summer. If they could somehow secure food until fall, the soldiers returning to the fields could harvest again and things might slowly stabilize. Since the start of the war, Cladnir had contributed more than any other family, so they should have received enough compensation to avoid this crisis. But the Emperor's only reward was a meager mine. The iron mine Alec, built more with the Emperor's interests in mind than the family's. His second reward was the marriage with the Pole. While he was thinking, Eric heard a noise and realized Misa had woken up. His mind went right back to the Alec iron mine. It would take years to develop, and that did nothing to solve the food crisis now. As Misa walked over, Eric remarked that she'd woken up late, but his thoughts stayed on the family's troubles. The king was pretending not to see it, so the family had to secure food on its own. It wasn't really a money problem, but with his father absent, every servant turned to Eric alone out of loyalty. The strain was worse than he expected, stifling like a coffin, and the whole family felt crushed by it. In the middle of that headache, Eric suddenly startled. Misa was beside him, tugging at his shirt, then she hugged him at once, catching him off guard. She held him even tighter, then climbed into his lap and sat there. Eric looked at Misa and thought about what he'd discussed with Ambrick. How could Ambrick understand when even Eric himself couldn't? Then Misa noticed something on the table. Eric opened the jar of sweets, took one out, and handed it to Misa. She ate it delicately and started to leave, but he asked her to stay a little longer. Watching her, Eric smiled. Just the fact that this little woman hadn't run from him and had simply hugged him brought a strange relief to all his frustration. The next day, 5 servants from the Crispin family arrived at the Cladnir mansion. When the Duchess asked what was happening, one explained that Miss Lacani had dropped her ribbon. Among nobles, ribbons are exchanged between men and women as signs of affection, so for an unmarried girl to lose one at her married ex-fiancé's house was a serious problem. The lady ordered the mansion servants to help search for it, and if rumors started, they were to say the ribbon belonged to the lady of the house. Dillers understood the order and withdrew. Then all the servants began searching for the lost ribbon. Among them, one woman kept looking around, clearly searching for someone. She fixed her attention on the imperial servant who attended Princess Misa. The servant turned her head too and looked back at her. After that, the two slipped away to an isolated place to talk. The woman said what she was about to say had to stay secret. That woman needed to be dead within 2 years at most. The nun answered that, if she wished, it could be done immediately, even tomorrow. But the woman said it wasn't that simple. They would need regular contact, and she couldn't keep using visits to the Duke's residence as an excuse. The servant agreed it would be better to set a time and place for the next meeting, and promised she'd be there. Later, Taliesin was in the room combing Misa's hair. She said they'd be dining together as a family that day, so she wanted Misa calm and well-behaved. Seeing her expression, the Duchess smiled and told her to pretend she hadn't heard that. She kept tending the princess's hair as she said it was important to eat well. Misa was a good girl with such beautiful hair, so she had to eat properly. At the doorway, the Count watched the scene with anger. During the family dinner, the mood stayed tense as the princess scraped her fork against the plate, and the harsh sound made both the Count and the servants uncomfortable, but the Duchess and Eric calmly continued eating. Noticing her husband's irritation, Taliesin said Misa was practicing so he should be patient. Then he looked over and saw Eric teaching the princess how to hold the knife properly and cut her food. The Margrave scoffed. How old was she to need that much care? The Duchess poured wine and told him it was better not to pay attention to Misa. After all, Misa didn't want his attention either. The Count shouted for her to apologize, but she ignored him and simply told Eric to make sure the princess ate some vegetables too. He couldn't understand why they treated that girl this way. Finally, he snapped and slammed the table, stood up, and said they'd soon have to greet His Majesty, so they should make sure she didn't fall or scratch herself. Then he grabbed his coat and left, while Eric kept feeding Misa and the Duchess watched with a smile. The Duchess then said that now that she thought about it, only a few days were left, and asked whether Eric had prepared the gifts for the palace. He said yes, something appropriate. Taliesin answered that was good. She trusted he knew what he was doing, and only hoped nothing went wrong. In the Kingdom of Achilles, married couples must visit their parents' homes 50 days after the wedding. For Eric and Misa, that meant the royal palace. A few days later, everyone was busy preparing for the trip. Inside the carriage, Eric watched the imperial servant. It was unusual to see one actually performing her duties properly. Then he looked at Misa lying beside him. After giving up on marriage entirely, he'd ended up with a wife under everyone's friendly looks, and having a wife wasn't as bad as he'd expected. Eric leaned down and slowly moved closer, wondering if she might at least know his name, but Misa quickly pulled away from him. He only smiled, thinking that even if she didn't know who he was, having someone to protect still made life worth living. He apologized for bothering her, saying he'd only asked out of concern. Then the imperial servant got into the carriage, gave Eric an expressionless look, and they finally headed for the royal palace. When they arrived, the two were led through a long, silent corridor. Eric took in the palace's design, harsh sunlight cutting through the glass windows, cold marble and gray covering every corner of the main hall. It felt built to intimidate. Every memory of the emperor's behavior brought only unease and fear. 20 years earlier, the young king had taken the throne and secured his rule without much trouble, largely because his mother's family, the Salakis, was immensely powerful. But 12 years ago, while many people were away at war, something happened in the capital, and the king changed overnight. The palace floors stayed stained with blood. Before one patch was cleaned, another head would be split open and left there. Eric wondered whose corpse would be waiting this time. At last they reached the final door, and seated before Misa and Eric was the emperor. Eric greeted His Majesty while holding Misa steady so she wouldn't fall. Smiling from the throne beside a black-haired woman, the emperor said it had been a long time, and that Misa's face was far more beautiful than the last time he'd seen her. Eric told Misa to greet His Majesty too, but when he let go of her, she immediately dropped to the floor and stayed there quietly, staring at the ceiling. The king silently watched his sister, then after a while smiled and remarked that her skin had improved a lot. The black-haired girl beside him commented that they might soon hear news of a child, and the emperor told Eric he was looking forward to it. Since the wedding night, Eric had been as careful as possible to avoid arousing the king's suspicion. He had no intention of making someone who understood nothing suffer childbirth, so he answered that they too hoped the child would come soon, though his wife's health was still poor. As Eric spoke, the emperor listened to the report from the attendant beside him. The attendant said the maids had spoken intriguingly about the blood-stained wedding night, yet when they bathed the princess, her lower body was still intact. Eric was stunned too, since that night her body and sheets had remained completely clean. After hearing that, the king rose and walked over to Eric and the princess. He demanded to know why Eric wasn't satisfied with the heir of the royal bloodline, and ordered him to answer at once. Had he falsified evidence? Was he toying with the royal family? Eric lowered his head and said no, never. He hadn't expected the maids to go that far. The king fixed him with sinister eyes and said he had deceived the royal family and made a fool of his adorable, stupid Misa. Then his anger flared and he called it betrayal against the royal family. Eric froze. When the emperor called something betrayal, there was no escape. His life, his parents' lives, even the vassals who served the Cladnir family would die. He saw no way out. They had brought only about 70 knights to the capital, nothing compared to the city guard. As Eric was thinking, the emperor beckoned Misa with his hand, and she immediately went to his feet. Stroking her hair, he asked his poor little sister Misa to say whether her husband had done anything to her on their wedding night. But instead of answering, she bent down as if trying to pick something up from the floor. In that instant, the emperor grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Seeing his wife like that, Eric anxiously told him not to, but the emperor ignored him and kept questioning his sister. Misa's face twisted in pain, and she said it hurt. The black-haired girl was shocked to witness it. She had never heard the princess speak since arriving at the palace. Eric was just as stunned. Then Misa pointed to her lower body and said it still hurt. She'd been hurting ever since that wedding night. As the emperor and Eric stared at her, Misa added that she didn't know what to do. It was the first time she had ever felt such pain. He still couldn't believe what was happening, that all this time she had been. Then the emperor cut her off. He didn't want to hear about his sister's private matters, and with open hatred he kicked Misa so hard she hit the ground. Eric rushed over, helped her up, and pulled her into a tight embrace. Grinding his teeth, he swore that one day he'd be the one taking that kick, not her. After meeting the king, they rode back to the Cladnir mansion. Eric held Misa the whole way, unsure whether she was asleep or not, and spent the ride deep in thought. Once they returned, the Mortimer hurried out to greet them, but Eric said he'd care for his wife himself, and no one was allowed on the West Wing's second floor today. Before leaving, he ordered him to go to the knight's residence, call Cullen, and have him stand guard on the second floor of the West Wing. Seeing Eric's grave expression, the imperial servant wondered what had happened. On the way to the room, Misa struggled and screamed in Eric's arms, trying to break free. When Cullen, Eric's right hand, arrived and announced that he had called him General Colonel. Still carrying the princess, Eric ordered him not to let anyone come near today, and if anything happened, to knock and tell him at once. Cullen obeyed and shut the door behind them. In the room, Eric threw Misa onto the bed and told her no one could hear her. Even if she cried or screamed, no one would come. Leaning over, he gripped her arm hard and asked if she understood that. No matter what she said, no one could hear. Furious, Eric demanded she speak, now that he knew she could clearly communicate. Misa only stared at him. Her lips parted as if she might answer, but instead she laughed, like she'd never understood him at all. Seeing that look, Eric coldly asked how much longer she planned to pretend. If he hadn't found out, would she have kept lying forever? Then she said, "Dear, it's better not to pay attention to Misa. After all, Misa doesn't want your attention either." Eric fell silent in confusion. Those were the exact words his mother once said to his father. Smiling at him, the princess thought that after all these years, she'd have to change her plans a little. For a moment, Eric could only stare. Then he asked why she'd pretended to be mad all this time, and what she was doing in front of the emperor earlier. Misa answered with another question. Did he think she could survive 10 years acting normal? Everyone was waiting for trouble between them, so they had to make it look like they were fine. Eric realized he'd heard those words from his mother before, and her voice was firm and elegant. Yet beneath her calm face and relaxed expression, her hands trembled slightly with tension. Eric thought about what it must have cost her to act insane all those years just to survive. It had to be unbearable. After a while, he moved away and said he had no intention of forcing her. He admitted it was hard to believe she'd been completely aware this whole time and wondered what she had been thinking all these years. He had heard that when the princess was 8, she saw her mother die, then watched the emperor kill her half-brothers one by one. To survive, she chose a life worse than an animal's, despised, mocked, and denied the dignity of a princess because no one treats a mad person like one. Thinking about those years left Eric speechless. Why had she gone that far? What was she planning? And how strong did she have to be to endure all of it? They hadn't known each other long, and Eric wondered if he could ease any of those painful years, or comfort her with shallow words about having survived hard times. He clenched his fist, wanting to say something to comfort her, but nothing felt right for someone so strong yet so fragile. The next morning, Misa was still asleep in her bed when the Mortimer and maids brought food to her room. The imperial servant wore an unpleasant expression as the Mortimer said he'd brought breakfast for both. Eric was already awake, so he told him to leave it on the table. Then the maid went to wake the princess and tell her to eat. Eric had assumed she'd be executed for giving the emperor false evidence, but now he saw she'd acted that way because she knew she could get away with it. And more than that, she had saved them. Without Misa, the Cladnir house and all its vassals would already be dead. Eric told the servant to let her sleep longer. His wife seemed exhausted after going out for the first time in a long time. She had no choice but to obey in silence, while the Mortimer bowed and respectfully asked whether the lord wanted to eat first, since his schedule must be busy today. Eric realized the imperial servants were here to check whether the two had anything like a true wedding night. They followed the emperor's orders and constantly watched them for anything to report back. Eric ate in silence, thinking that having breakfast alone after so long felt dry as sand. Misa's tasks for today: make a mess at the table like a madwoman, tear the black-haired man's clothes like a madwoman, and pull the white-haired imperial servant's hair like a madwoman. She sighed. Fortunately, she'd managed at least half of today's plan, though she'd lost time because the maid's body inspection took so long. Misa worried the black-haired man might tell others her secret. Yesterday, he'd seemed furious because of her. If he exposed her in the palace, she could be thrown out of this house, dragged back, and this time die in the darkness of that room. She forced the thought away. After surviving that hell so long, she could never go back. Even if he had been angry, Misa didn't think he seemed like that kind of person. Still, if he talked about her, she'd have to act. Misa started running while the maid told her to stop. Taliesin was in the room and asked how she was, whether she had slept well. Misa said nothing. She had to keep pretending. The lady reminded her not to walk around alone without a maid or servant because it was dangerous. Misa ignored that and quickly jumped into her lap, catching the Duchess by surprise. The lady stroked her head and said it seemed she still hadn't fully woken up. Misa felt relieved. Thankfully, the lady was treating her the same as always, so that man hadn't said anything yet. She turned back to the servant and gestured for him to continue, so he reported on the garden repairs. Since she had suggested changing the materials, he looked into it and asked whether she'd prefer mahogany, which cost 2 gera per carril. The princess remembered that the palace garden used andam wood, imported from the southern islands and 5 times more expensive than mahogany. She wondered if that imported wood was too costly for this family. Having only lived in the royal palace and the Celia palace, Misa wasn't sure the economic gap could be this large. Then the man set down a plate and said the Rogenton family farm had recently started producing butter and cheese. It was expensive but supposedly high quality, so he had brought some for Madame. She tasted a piece as he explained it cost 20 gera for 1 gera. The princess was stunned. How could something that small cost so much? The lady handed her another piece, and Misa remembered a maid once said a bag of flour cost 20 gera, so that meant this little piece of butter cost as much as an entire bag of flour. She recalled the black-haired man worrying about the people's food. If money was tight, they should be buying flour. Maybe this place's finances weren't as solid as she'd thought. The Duke looked at her fondly and asked if she liked it. Since she seemed to be eating so well, he told the man to keep 5 pieces just for Misa. The princess grew uneasy. That was extremely expensive. Since 100 paws equals a gera, they were spending all that on 5 pieces of butter. She felt guilty. The black-haired man and the lady looked happy just to see her eat. Misa wondered why they treated her this way, but whatever the reason, kindness like this couldn't truly be meant for her. No one would go that far for the plague of a mad princess. After a while, Eric arrived and asked Misa to come to him. She didn't move and stayed in the Duke's lap, while the lady commented that it was strange since the princess usually came quietly. Misa made a pitiful face and babbled like a child, but inwardly she didn't want to go near that man. He knew her secret. Then Eric suddenly pulled her to his side, sat her on his lap, and stared straight into her eyes. He whispered that she should stay quiet and come with him. Eric also told her he hadn't said anything about what happened yesterday, so she didn't need to worry. Misa was speechless. She had been sure he'd tell while Eric only looked at her without any expression. Now the two were eating dinner together, and Eric asked whether Misa could eat by herself. Standing in front of him with a fork and knife, she thought she really disliked this man. Did everything have to be this formal? And the servants in this house were so inefficient. They knew she preferred eating with her hands, yet they still brought forks and knives. She hadn't used cutlery for more than it had been over 10 years since she'd used cutlery, so when Misa tried cutting the meat, her hands shook. Just as she feared, acting mad for so long had cost her some basic skills. Watching her with the utensils, Eric murmured that as expected, she was good at it.
Good at it? Was he mocking her?
She dropped the fork, decided this man was strange, and started eating with her hands instead. Eric looked at her again and asked what the problem was. Now, did using cutlery make her uncomfortable? Under her breath, Misa muttered that if the servants came back and found the table spotless, they'd get suspicious and make things harder. As she licked her arm, she glanced up at Eric and froze. His face had turned red and he told her to stop. Misa just stared, confused about what exactly she had done wrong. Then Eric dragged over a chair and sat beside her. Misa tensed, thinking she'd done plenty worse before, even spit in his face, and he still hadn't punished her. Instead, he gently lifted her chin and asked her to look at him for a moment. He wondered aloud whether he should go back to wiping her face and feeding her himself like before. Misa figured he wasn't as oblivious as he looked. Then Eric asked for her hand too, so he could clean it. She looked at him, then quickly turned her eyes away. She couldn't meet his gaze. When the meal ended, the maids came in to clear the table, and Eric quietly waited while Misa took her bath. She muttered that the water was cold, and the imperial servant remarked that it was amazing. She never caught a cold. It'd be nice if she could just rest in comfort for a few days. Misa stared at her, wondering what this was about. The woman usually left bathing to Grandaleona, so why was she personally meddling today? Then Misa yanked the servant's hair, and the woman, furious, suddenly tried to shove her under the bathwater. While they were still in the bath, Eric came in and asked what she was doing. The servant snapped back, asking why he had appeared so suddenly, then claimed this was normal, that the princess always reacted like this during baths, sometimes hurting herself badly, and there was nothing she could do. Misa could only think about what a liar she was. The servant then asked Eric to step out for a moment so she could finish bathing the princess, but Eric said he'd do it himself. Alarmed, she argued that it was difficult. Misa might drown herself or try to run, so he shouldn't take on such a troublesome job. Eric replied that made it even more appropriate for him, her husband, to handle it. Misa watched them seriously, as the servant insisted bathing her alone wouldn't be easy. First, he had to wash her hair with the proper shampoo, treat the ends with special oil, then rinse, dry it completely, and apply cream too. Misa thought the woman was shamelessly lying. Usually she just scrubbed her with soap, and now she was listing all this. Though compared to the palace where they used the same caustic soda as for laundry, it was still a little better. After hearing enough, Eric told the servant to rest. He would bathe his wife himself. The servant finally withdrew, leaving them alone in the bathroom. Eric thought he'd managed to get rid of that woman, but that just left him with another problem. Turning back, he asked if Misa might be able to wash on her own. She was startled. How would a nun even bathe alone? She shook her head to say there was no way she could. Embarrassed and a little irritated, Eric said okay but asked her to wait a moment. While Misa stood there, he gathered all the products the servant had mentioned. Watching him, she wondered why he looked angry again. She started walking toward him. There was no point in making him more upset, so for now she should at least cooperate. Eric covered his face with one hand, unable to bear the sight of her standing there. But when he finally looked, what he saw frightened him. As Misa removed the towel, she thought this man might one day annul the marriage and expose her secret to the palace. Her hair hid some of the scars etched across her body. Back on their wedding night, when she'd first seen Eric's large, intimidating figure, she decided it was safer not to resist him any more than necessary. But the moment she saw his expression, Misa froze. It dragged her back to those moments of terror when the Emperor tortured her, claiming he was curing her madness. Now she worried she'd made a mistake. Eric was big and intimidating, yes, but he'd also been very kind. Still, his expression looked as if he were burning with anger. Misa quickly turned away, crouched down, and began trembling all over. She didn't know why he was angry this time, but that hardly mattered. Not when she'd been hurt for no reason before. Then Eric gently touched her scars, and Misa was startled by the warmth of his fingers. He murmured that for wounds to leave marks like these, they must have been severe, and asked who could possibly have done this to the princess. Misa wondered if he pitied her. Pain colored his voice, unlike anything she'd ever heard from him before. For some reason, that unfamiliar sadness made her feel she owed him an answer, so she said it was the Emperor. Eric went still. From the scars alone, he could tell it hadn't happened just once or twice. He covered his face with one hand and let out a long sigh. Then he took her arm and said they should finish quickly and get out before she caught a cold. Misa was baffled. She thought he was angry, but now he was looking at her with deep pity. Eric admitted this was his first time doing this too, and asked her to speak up if anything made her uncomfortable. Misa had assumed he could just wash her like a dog, yet he was being unbelievably careful. Eric began washing her hair, softly massaging her scalp with the tips of his fingers. Misa realized it felt nice and wondered if baths had always been this pleasant. Ever since losing her family and living as a madwoman, she'd never had anything like this. Being touched gently again was a feeling she'd missed for years. Eric still looked at her with pity, but he was glad her face seemed to be enjoying it. Once he finished her hair, he started washing her body too, gently running the cloth over his wife's neck. Misa squeezed her eyes shut, thinking it tickled, and tried to hold back her laughter so he wouldn't notice. She managed it only for a moment, then she laughed. They looked at each other, and Misa realized a true madwoman wouldn't care who was washing her body. But Eric's emotions kept rubbing off on her like an infection, leaving her unsettled for no clear reason. And now that she thought about it, she felt just as embarrassed as the man in front of her. Later, Eric collapsed onto the bed, ready to sleep. Sitting beside him, Misa could tell he was completely drained. He held out a hand and asked her to lie down and rest too, then fell asleep almost at once while she kept staring at him. She thought he was the one who needed rest, not her. Looking at him more closely, she honestly couldn't understand him. Yesterday, he'd been prickly and ungrateful, even after she'd saved him during the visit to the Emperor. Today, he'd looked at her scars with sympathy, yet other times his jokes slipped and his dislike showed through. Even so, he seemed like a rare good person, completely different from her. Studying him, Misa wondered if he was fully asleep now. He looked truly exhausted. She slipped out of bed, opened the door, and left the room. But Eric wasn't asleep at all, and noticed her go. He got up and followed the sound of voices from another room in the mansion. The closer he came, the clearer the talking became. Slowly opening the door, he heard someone say, "This is how much I like it," then heard the name Edel, the private servant of his mother. Inside, Misa stood before a mirror, talking to herself. "Edel, could you get me medicine for a headache? I should be in my room." Those were lines from a conversation Thalis and Edel had shared some time ago. Eric could hardly believe what he was seeing. She repeated every phrase perfectly, including ones she'd heard from everyone in the mansion, even the words he'd spoken in front of her. Then Misa caught Eric in the mirror, silently watching. She repeated another line she'd heard from Thalis at dinner with the Count. "Dear, Misa is practicing, so you must be patient." The next day, Imperial servants examined the princess's body. One noted she was still untouched even after they had sent the others away. The other said that if anything had happened last night, her lower body wouldn't be in such good condition. As they looked her over, they concluded there was still nothing to report to the Emperor. Misa thought she'd endured this inspection so many times. Maybe it was lucky the man with black hair had woken in her, but today she felt especially filthy, and yesterday she'd shown another strange side of herself. When she was only acting mad, she didn't care if people pointed and mocked her, but now the thought that someone might laugh at her real self made her deeply uncomfortable. One servant sneered that even seeing her naked body hadn't stirred his desire. After all, who would want to give his seed to a madwoman? The other said that despite that, they'd still been ordered to keep watching her for now. Misa grew worried. It had been a while since she'd had any bruise or injury, and at this point she ought to take a serious fall, or cause some scene that would make everyone furious at her. Before getting dressed, Misa wandered the mansion with a servant, wondering how to injure herself without doing too much damage. Maybe she should even break something valuable, but she quickly dropped that idea. Breaking things in a house built with 20 woods felt wrong. Then she noticed the staircase, and thought a small broken bone might be the easiest solution. When the servant called her to breakfast, Misa decided pain was unavoidable. If she controlled it, she could fake another palace-style accident. She shut her eyes and let her legs go weak. But before she could fall, Eric caught her and said he couldn't keep watching this. Misa stared, wondering when he had even shown up. Still holding her, Eric told the servant he'd look after his wife today and could rest. Misa, meanwhile, was furious at the interruption. Later, sitting with her on a garden bench, Eric said all the stuffed birds had been moved elsewhere, so she had nothing to worry about. Then he asked if she truly disliked birds, and Misa said yes. Watching her, he asked if there was some special reason. She didn't answer. Eric waited, but Misa only thought about how annoying he was. So he tried another approach, asking when she speaks, where she feels comfortable, then assuring her no one would come there and she could talk freely. Misa thought that after more than 10 years without proper communication, she'd lost part of that ability, but she couldn't tell him. Eric looked at her seriously and asked if speaking itself was difficult for her. That caught her off guard, especially since she'd thought she was also good at hiding things in her head. Eric guessed that maybe it had been so long since she'd spoken to anyone that she wasn't used to arranging words in her mind anymore. Misa was startled again and wondered if he could somehow read minds. Unable to explain, she just shook her head to show he was more or less right. Eric said that would explain why she repeats what others say, and that her memory is incredible. He asked her if possible to answer out loud instead of just nodding, even if it was only something short. Looking at his serious face all the time, Misa still didn't want to, but somehow felt she had to answer, so she closed her eyes and said she agreed. At once, she covered her mouth with both hands. Her voice came out strange again, and the sound embarrassed her enough to wonder why this kept happening. Eric said it would improve quickly if she kept talking, especially since she could already repeat others perfectly. As he took her hand, he remembered that even before the Emperor, whenever she paused to think, her voice had sounded strange. Setting that aside, Eric asked if she could copy what he was about to do for a moment. He placed her fingers on her throat and explained that the throat normally rests there, while the muscles shift with pitch. The position they take when no sound comes out is your natural voice. Someone had taught him that during his transformation period, so he asked if she wanted to try it now. Misa put her fingers on her throat and practiced just as Eric had shown her. While she kept trying, she looked at him. Eric asked if she felt anything and said that if there was something she wanted to tell him, she should just say it. Misa instead asked what a voice change was, and he laughed, then apologized for laughing at her first question. He explained that everyone's voice changes at a certain age, and that's called the transformation period. Then Eric asked if there was anything else she wanted to know or say. Misa thought this was urgent, so she repeated something she'd heard before. He still hadn't touched her because she bites people. Eric asked what she meant, and Misa couldn't understand how he still didn't get it. So she pulled her legs onto the bench, turned toward him, and tugged lightly at his clothes. That finally made Eric understand, and he flushed at the sight. He quickly closed her legs and said he understood, but she didn't need to do that. Misa looked at him seriously, and asked when they were going to do it. The blunt question caught Eric off guard. Meanwhile, Misa thought they had to do it soon. She didn't know when the king might summon her again, and next time she might not be able to make excuses like before. Eric answered that this takes time. First, he thought they should get to know each other better as husband and wife, so they could solve the problem she'd mentioned a little faster. Then he stood while Misa watched him. Turning back to her, Eric said he was going to take her to see the stove. Misa thought this was no time to wait. The servants had said the Emperor ordered closer watch, and if she didn't act fast, everything she'd done would be wasted. Then the two of them started walking through the garden. Eric pointed out flowers, explained where they came from, and asked whether walking itself made her uncomfortable. Misa stopped and gave him a bright, cheerful smile. Only then did Eric realize she'd fooled him all along. He'd believed she truly didn't know how to walk properly. Misa felt proud. It had taken real effort to make it look natural whenever she stumbled or fell after only a little walking. Eric asked how she did it, and Misa thought it was hard to explain. You had to tense the backs of the thighs and the shins just right to keep your balance wrong. Instead of explaining, she simply held her arms out to Eric. He asked if she wanted him to carry her, and once she was in his arms, Eric noted that Misa still hadn't walked more than normal. Settling against him, Misa thought she was lucky. He was an even better man than she'd first assumed. This kindness had lasted a long time now, and he still never pressed her for the real reason she kept pretending to be crazy. A day before the wedding, a temple priestess had read Misa the formal procedure for the wedding night. Because it was ritual, the whole reading was delivered in a flat, even tone. Still, parts of it had sounded strange, especially when the priestess said it could cause a sharp pain down there. At the time, Misa had only thought it was terribly boring. But now it had become one of the most important ways to secure this marriage. She wanted to do it immediately, yet ever since their talk a few days ago, Eric kept putting her off with more conversation. Eric noticed how much Misa was staring at him, and asked if she wanted to say something. She stayed quiet, thinking that even this man's life depended on the king, so why did she seem to be the only one this nervous? At last, the princess asked when they were going to do it. Eric said nothing, and Misa took that as confirmation. What if his delaying the first night meant he wanted to break this marriage? Maybe all this kindness was fake, and he was only buying time until he could throw her out. Eric stood and called to Misa, but she was too lost in thought, imagining he simply wasn't interested until he'd seen her body naked. With a sad look, she thought about how kind the people in this mansion were. Yet no matter how many times she pushed them away, those insecure thoughts kept returning to her mind. Eric called her name again, while she kept thinking they needed to spend the first night together as soon as possible. She wanted to secure this marriage because she truly liked her life there. In that place, she felt as if she'd gone back to the brief times when joy came simply from being herself. To survive, she'd pretended to be mad and endured years of torture from the Emperor, who kept ordering her to stop acting until eventually he started to believe it. Then Eric touched her shoulder, pulling her out of those thoughts. He asked what was wrong. He'd called her several times. Misa lowered her head, thinking she couldn't go back to the Emperor's hands. She had waited years for this chance and couldn't waste it. Clutching the pillow, she repeated a line one of the imperial servants had said earlier: who would want to give their seed to a madwoman? Eric went speechless for a moment, trying to process it, then asked who had dared say that to her. Since she only spoke perfectly by repeating things she'd heard, he was sure it had come from someone. Sitting beside her on the bed, Eric said that was probably what she'd meant earlier by the stove. He told her they still knew almost nothing about each other, so they shouldn't rush. Misa, though, was already tired of hearing him talk about getting to know each other. She threw the pillow onto the bed and asked if he wanted to get to know his wife first. In that strange voice, she added that then they could solve the problem he mentioned a little faster. Eric said her speaking had somehow improved very quickly. Then, looking at her, he asked if she meant doing it right now. He moved closer and said she seemed to like that idea a lot, but then turned his face away and admitted he needed time to prepare mentally, because it wasn't something he could do immediately. So instead, they would at least get to know each other a little tonight. Misa said nothing, though she'd heard he'd done well in his first meeting, so this reaction seemed odd. Once they were ready to lie down, Eric explained that the situation was complicated in many ways, just like it was for the ladies who came from the palace with their husbands. Taking her hand, he said everything would be fine, so each night she should tell him at least a little about herself, and he would do the same. Starting with something easy, Eric asked her favorite food. Misa answered meat, and he admitted he'd expected her to say cake. Before getting back to the basic questions, Eric asked if staying inside the house all the time made her feel stressed. Misa didn't get it. How could that stress her when she'd always lived like this? She closed her eyes, searching for the words, then said, "Eric, stop." Startled, he asked if that was his mother's phrasing again, then suddenly burst out laughing. Misa just stared, wondering what was so funny. Still smiling, he said he was just happy she'd finally called him by name, and asked her to say it again. Since his name wasn't hard to pronounce, Misa did. Hearing it once more made him even happier. He suddenly cupped her face and said how good it was to hear his wife's voice. Misa blinked in surprise, and Eric said that since she'd answered him, she'd shown a little of her true self. Then he leaned in and gently kissed her forehead, and her heart warmed at once. The princess was even more startled, while Eric just smiled at her. Misa touched her forehead as if asking whether that was all, and he told her to share more about herself later. After a while, she fell asleep, but Eric stayed awake, thinking about how, since childhood, Misa had deceived so many people through sheer tenacity and stubbornness. Even those who saw her wounds had been fooled by that effort. It was shocking that she'd hidden everything this well for so long. Her acting was flawless. Eric wondered what she was really thinking. What plan could drive her this far? Or if she was only trying to survive this hell and someday live her dreams. Watching her sleep, he felt deeply curious about the person beside him. More than anything, he wanted to know her better and help however he could. Without noticing, he fell asleep too. The next morning, a loud scream tore through the corridor, and once Eric was told what happened, he rushed over. When he arrived, everyone was already tense about the incident. The Duchess wore a grim expression, and the imperial servants were sweating with nerves. Then he saw Misa lying in bed, her face covered in wounds, and couldn't imagine what had happened to leave his wife like this. Earlier that morning, before it happened, the imperial servants had been watching Misa in bed. One remarked that nothing seemed to have happened last night since the sheet was only wrinkled on one side. The other guessed they hadn't even touched each other. But then Maleka noticed something very strange. She leaned in with a sinister look, thinking Misa's usual sleeping state didn't seem to be there this time. That was odd. The princess often got hurt because of her madness. Maleka started replaying the earlier moments, remembering how Misa had looked at her with cold eyes and how that man was always protecting her. She grew suspicious because it had been a long time since Misa last got hurt. That used to happen constantly in the royal palace. While Misa still lay there, the other servant asked what Maleka was doing, and she brushed it off as nothing. But when Maleka mentioned that tomorrow was the meeting of that house, Misa panicked, wondering what they meant. Suddenly the servant grabbed her and asked what she was planning this time. Misa felt sick, fixating on that meeting. What house were they talking about? For over 10 years, the obsessive-compulsive disorder building inside her had been sending one clear warning: danger. Misa asked herself why the three pillars of the kingdom were like this. Meanwhile, Daly asked her companion how much longer they had to stay there, and was told not long. Misa suddenly started laughing. The servants turned to her with sinister looks, and she looked away, thinking that today was the day. If she didn't slip up, she could make them suspicious. Out in the mansion corridor, two servants were carrying baskets of clothes when one asked if the other had heard something strange just now. The other said yes, it sounded like a scream. Then Misa sprinted toward them at full speed, and the two froze as the princess shot past. They could hardly believe it. That was definitely the missus. The servants ran after her, shouting to ask where she was going alone, while Misa thought she'd already secured 2 witnesses for what she was about to do. She glanced one way, then the other, and noticed a servant climbing the stairs. She changed direction at once. The stairs wouldn't work, so she needed some other suitable spot. Misa stopped in front of an open door, looked at the open window, and decided this might work. Then she ran again. Climbing onto the support beam, she thought whatever was below could serve as a pillow. Without hesitating, Misa jumped with her arms spread. At that moment, flowers were blooming everywhere, and Misa imagined that one day she'd be as free as she felt now. Back in the present, the Duchess angrily demanded whether it was really so hard for the imperial servants to keep Misa from getting hurt in such a short time. She snapped that even after dressing her, they were supposed to stay by the princess's side at all times. But that scolding was cut off when Eric called out. He looked at the two servants being berated by his mother, then touched Misa's head to check on her. The moment he did, he realized she was pretending to be unconscious. Her face started sweating too much under his hand. Eric figured it didn't look very serious, yet somehow it was also very serious. Then he told the person behind him to prepare treatment, and she obeyed at once. Her name was Gela, a member of the Order of the Knights of Cladnir. Eric also announced that from now on, he would assign a maid in the mansion to stay with his wife. Then he told Paradil to take Lady Maleka to the palace immediately, report that the princess had an accident to His Majesty, and come back. After that, he ordered everyone to leave the room at once. Eric stayed silent, watching them go, until he turned at the Duke's remark that he'd never imagined it would be this hard to control the blunders of incompetent people. Furious, the Duke said those people needed their limbs broken to come to their senses. Hearing that, Eric grew uneasy. It kept happening. His mother still saw Misa as the image of her younger sister, Rose. Rose had been about to turn 10 with spring ahead of her when she was alone in the forest and got run over by a horse driven by a drunk man. She died that day, and the Duchess completely lost her mind. The next day, Taliesin gave the same punishment to the stable owner who provided the horse, his family, even the elderly parents and small children. The Count condemned his wife's excesses, and after that, he and the Duchess became completely estranged. Now she was close to going mad again, just like before. Eric had no idea where his mother's anger might turn next, so he decided it was better to keep her out of this. He told her plainly that this involved his wife, so he would handle it himself. Then Misa's examiner reported that from the examination, the princess had only a mild itch, and after treatment she wouldn't have trouble moving. Fortunately, there were no other serious injuries. Relieved, the lady thanked God. She rose from her chair and admitted he was right. She really did need to calm down a little. She stepped over to Misa and wished her a quick recovery, and the Duchess kept looking at her for a while. She was so attached to Misa that she couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Then she left, asking Eric to take good care of her. After the Duchess was gone, the woman beside her also asked for permission to leave. But Eric stopped her, reminding her that she'd said there were no other serious injuries. With a grave look, he asked if she was certain. She admitted there were several deep wounds on Misa's body, but she hadn't mentioned them because they were old, untreated injuries. Nervously, she swore she had no intention of speaking of it anywhere, as he knew she never leaked confidential information, not even when she was drunk. Eric asked if she wouldn't be working these next few days, and she said no. He ordered her to report there starting tomorrow morning and said he'd inform head maid Edel. Misa, hearing that, asked what he meant by tomorrow and said it was so sudden. Eric replied that it was an order, and she answered that she had nothing else to do, so she'd follow the orders of her captain. Once the woman left, Eric said he knew perfectly well that Misa wasn't asleep, and asked why she'd hurt herself so badly this time. In a stern voice, he added that there had to be some reason. He asked again, but Misa stayed silent, pretending to sleep while her body shook. Seeing how clearly nervous she was, Eric sat beside her and gently said it was all right. She could tell him. So what caused today's commotion? Eric asked. Slowly, Misa turned her face and said there was a reason, but it was hard to explain. Eric rested a hand on her head and told her never to hurt herself again. If she had to, it was better to break something else. She said okay. He clarified that he wasn't telling her to do nothing at all. Anything was fine as long as she didn't hurt herself. Then, with a serious look, Eric demanded a promise right now that she would never injure herself again. Nervously, Misa promised him right there. He let out a sigh and told her to rest for now, and if she got hungry, she should just call him. Eric was about to leave, but Misa looked at him like she wanted to say something. Realizing that, he asked what it was, and she asked about the woman from earlier. He said she seemed very curious, so he explained that the woman was a disciple of a famous doctor and extremely skilled at treating wounds, even if she didn't look like it. On top of that, she was strong enough to kill several wolves with ease, and also a bit reckless with her mouth. Misa asked just how reckless she was. Eric replied that she wasn't someone who could be bought. As a member of the National Assembly, she had never been captured or tortured, but even so, as a precaution, he asked if she remembered Cullen from the day they came back from the palace. From now on, Eric plans to leave him guarding the West Wing on the second floor. Cullen is the left-handed knight who lost 2 fingers to torture, and the most reliable man Eric knows. He never even told Cullen about his wife, so Misa had nothing to worry about. That instantly cheered her up, especially when Eric added that, since his wife is injured, he'll be stepping away from knightly duties for a while. Running his fingers through Misa's hair, he said he'd finish the kingdom's most urgent business, then come back early in the morning. Eric wondered if she showed him so many expressions because he was the only one who knew her secret. Even when she's anxious, she settles down fast, and somehow still seems excited. Misa suddenly jumped out of bed and eagerly asked if that meant they'd have lots of time together and lots of talk. Tugging at her sleeve, she asked if they were gonna do that now that they were getting closer. Eric snapped, asking what exactly she meant. How could they do that when she was injured? Turning away, he told her not to think about it again until she was fully healed. When he looked back at her, he thought about how, unlike him, raised under etiquette and custom, the woman before him was completely different. Eric asked why this was suddenly so urgent, and Misa answered with something he'd heard before. You said you never even touched the princess, so go to the priest and ask for a divorce. Common sense says it would be better to get rid of her. She was supposed to marry that lackey Crispin. What kind of misfortune is this? Eric was stunned. Muttering that it couldn't be true, he realized she'd actually been listening to the nonsense Ambrick said when they met. Grabbing Misa by the shoulders, he told her he had no intention of ending the marriage. Never. They still had many years ahead of them, and now that they were finally getting to know each other, there was no reason to force anything. Misa turned away as Eric said she was having those strange thoughts again. If she had any doubts or worries, she should ask him at once. There was nothing he couldn't answer. Did she really think he was hiding something from his wife? Eric pointed out that she sat on his lap reading every kind of document, even confidential ones, and still suspected he was keeping secrets. He laid her back down and told her to rest for the day. If she couldn't sleep, did she want him to call the maids? She didn't get it, so he explained that she was always around their work area and seemed to enjoy it there, but Eric was surprised when Misa said it wasn't fun at all. The kitchen and laundry were always busy, loud, and chaotic. She only went there because the maids talked, and she could hear everything. Eric asked if she went to the maid's room just to gather information, and whether she had done the same thing at the royal palace too. Misa happily said yes. She'd heard why the president was still in office, and things like how much Lady Maria, the head maid, had received. With shining eyes, the princess proudly declared that she knew everything. Still thrilled, she asked if Eric knew the white-haired butler liked Edel. The maid said the butler was in love with the head maid, but she was actually into rougher men. Eric cut in. Wait, how does your butler like Edel? Misa kept rattling off more gossip she'd heard while Eric wondered how she could remember everything so perfectly. It amazed him. It was as if everything she'd done until now had a purpose. Misa blinked in surprise when Eric placed his hand beside her. Lying down next to her, he said he wanted to talk a little more, closer this time, while thinking he might pull something important from Misa. She was delighted. She'd always loved gossip, and having someone to share it with felt wonderful. Eric asked why Lady Maleka had received so much money from the head maid Namarea. Misa instantly lost interest. He didn't want gossip, he wanted information. Turning away, she listened as Eric asked if she couldn't tell him something that would help them get closer faster. After thinking it over, Misa said, Ponte Aguda. Of the 3 pillars of the royal palace, Maleka is called Ponte Aguda. The 3 pillars are the 3 families representing the kingdom of Achilles, the Cladnir, Salacasi, and Crispin families. The king's maternal line, the Salacasi, was massacred years ago and now means almost nothing. Eric remembered a talk he'd had with Lacan and Crispin some time ago and realized someone had been watching them, the imperial servant, Maleka. Misa was startled when he said the pillar Lady Maleka belonged to was probably the Crispin family, and that he'd need people on both sides to find out what was going on. Misa started wondering whether this man was about to do something reckless, but then Eric kissed her, cutting off her thoughts. Startled, Misa asked what that was. He told her it was payment for her answer. Eric looked at her tenderly, while Misa, still stunned, wondered what she should do if he really did something foolish. The next morning, Eric entered the room and suddenly heard someone demanding to know what servant Maleka meant by that. Furious, Gela asked if she was accusing her of bringing something that would harm the princess. Maleka said the ointment might be poisonous, and she'd still dared to put it on the princess. Gela got even angrier, so she opened the ointment, scooped up a little with her fingertips, and put it in her mouth. Then she shouted that she was perfectly fine as anyone could see, and if Maleka was so worried, why didn't she try a little too? Eric smiled at the scene. It seemed he'd chosen the right person to care for Misa. Leaving it to Gela, he walked over to the princess. Misa was biting the sheet when Eric called to her. Gently brushing her hair, he said he'd come back after lunch, and the maids watched as he told her he'd return soon, so she should rest a little more. Before leaving, he asked them to take care of his wife and stepped out. Once outside, Eric still couldn't make sense of Misa's actions the day before. Why keep acting even while suffering like that? Still, yesterday's incident had given him a chance to pressure the imperial servants. Then he wondered if maybe that was exactly what Misa wanted. To understand her true intentions, his first priority was lowering the emperor's guard, then moving forward step by step. Eric walked on in anger, thinking that one day he'd repay everything the emperor had done to his wife. Later, Ambrick asked if Eric wanted him to train the knights. Eric said yes for a while. Ambrick grumbled about these sudden decisions and all the extra work, so Eric asked what he did besides chase girls. Fed up with his cousin's constant whining, he ended the discussion, then threw Ambrick out and told him to start in the morning. Back in the room, Cullen reported that he'd gathered the material Eric wanted on servant Maleka and the Crispin family. Eric praised his right-hand man, then told him to summon the head maid, but not tell his mother anything. Someone knocked, Eric told them to come in, and Gela asked what this was about, saying a servant had quietly called her in. Gela was a talented head maid Taliesin had hired when she was still a child. After going to the royal palace with Lady Maleka yesterday to inform the emperor about the incident with the princess, she had carefully brought back a copy of the report on the serious disturbance. Fortunately, she'd managed to report the facts accurately. Eric said that thanks to her, getting rid of the 2 imperial servants had been easier, but if their replacements were the same, it would all be pointless. So he told Gela that's why he needed her help. She was better suited than he was to handle palace obligations. Eric had spent 12 years on the battlefield, while she stayed in the capital, dealing with other families, gathering information, and managing all kinds of trouble. He said it would be better for her to act directly, and added that he'd already gotten permission from his mother to borrow her. Still, he'd rather the information uncovered in this investigation not reach his mother's ears. A little uneasy, Jella said that was fine. Eric then reported hearing that servant Maleka had once been bribed by the head maid Nemarea. He wanted to investigate that first, so he asked who Jella could get in touch with. Jella said reaching the head maid directly would be difficult, but she'd heard that Nemarea's right hand, Viscountess Maine, was worried about her brother-in-law's cases. If they could solve that problem for her, she might agree to anything. Later, Eric opened the bedroom door and announced that he was back, only to stop at the sight in front of him. Misa was painting on the floor, and he asked what they were doing now. Jella explained that music or theater could help someone with a troubled mind, but painting seemed better since it could be done in the room. Eric said he'd never heard of that, and she went on to explain it wasn't from any study or research. She'd only heard the young lady had been through a lot and thought someone with pent-up emotions needed a way to release them. Eric looked at Misa's face and could tell from her expression that she was proud of fooling Jella, which made him smile. Eric walked over to Misa and said that from now on, Jella should just read to her. If she did, Misa would take a good nap. Jella thought that sounded nice. If it was a book, maybe a fairy tale. But neither Eric nor Misa was listening. It was like they were the only two people in the room. Jella kept rambling that she'd go get a fairy tale book right away, but Eric cut her off and said that was enough for today. She asked why, and he shot back that she surely had other work, so she should come again tomorrow morning. Downcast, Jill asked if the doctor's work was still continuing. He said yes, then asked if there was anything else. She said no, so she'd see him tomorrow. Once she left, she paused for a second, then exploded. How could he work her to death like this, making her do both doctor and maid work for the same salary? She knew there'd be less doctoring after the war, but if this was it, she should have stayed in her village treating patients. Cullen pointed out she was being paid for both jobs. That instantly cheered her up. If she was paid for both, then she had nothing to complain about. Just then, Eric suddenly opened the door and looking at Jill, asked where the clothes were to change her. Jill assumed he meant bathing her and said she'd forgotten that, but Eric said no. He only wanted to know where the clothes were. She told him they were under the shelf. He thanked her and shut the door in her face. She turned to Cullen and said this was normal. The captain only talks about the matter at hand. Cullen said all captains are like that, which was what made it surprising. Jill said that wasn't the point. Even so, he always greets the young lady politely. Cullen asked what was strange about showing respect to the princess. Jill said the captain can barely speak to her, yet the way he looks at her is different. Still, she pushed the thought away. If they get along, that's a good thing. Cullen said he'd never seen how the captain treats the princess directly, so he couldn't be sure, but Eric had always been strict about etiquette. His tone might be cold, but he never treated them harshly. Fired up again, Jill said she just hoped he wasn't hiding anything from them. More than anything, he values trust. While Eric prepared the bath, he asked if Misa liked playing with ink. She muttered that she didn't want a children's book, so he asked what she meant. Misa said she wanted adult books, not children's ones. Eric said that actually made sense. Books with lots of dialogue would help her speech improve faster, so next time he'd have Jill bring novels with many conversations. A little clumsily, the princess repeated something she'd heard before, that she lacked basic manners, so she couldn't talk to him properly. Eric smiled and said that was fine. He'd also ask for books on good basic manners. Then he opened his arms and said the bath was ready, so let's go. But Misa just stared, then suddenly turned her back to him. Eric asked what was wrong, and she explained that his face gets embarrassed when he bathes her, which makes her uncomfortable. Not quite following, he asked if his face embarrassed her. She clarified that his face turns red when he bathes her. Then Misa pointed at the tub, said she'd do it alone, and told Eric to leave. He said that might be difficult, but her expression made it clear she meant it. A little uneasy, Eric asked to at least wash her hair and get the paint out. Misa looked at him and shook her head. She'd handle even that. As he was about to leave her to the bath, he added that now that he thought about it, she still didn't arrange her words very well, so from now on she should say simple words out loud. Practice would help. Misa said fine, then told him to go now. He asked if she was really sure, and she insisted yes, just go. That answer made him smile, so he backed out and told her to call him if she needed anything. After leaving the bathroom, Eric stayed by the door. Then he suddenly heard a loud bang and turned, asking what that was. A few seconds later, he heard running water, smiled, and figured somehow everything was fine. After a while, the door opened, and Misa came out looking thoroughly unhappy. He asked if everything went well, and she muttered that tomorrow Gela would bathe her instead. Eric smiled and agreed that tomorrow Gela would take care of it. Then he asked her to come closer so he could redo the dressing. As he changed the bandages on Misa's wounds, Eric asked how her morning had gone. She said she liked Gela. It was fun. He noticed her fingertips were all wrinkled from the bath and asked if she felt okay, where she was gripping. Misa said yes, so he told her he'd informed the kitchen that she liked meat. Starting tomorrow, they'd serve plenty, but he asked why she'd been so thin before. Misa repeated words she'd heard before. Why bother with food? It's a nuisance. She probably puts more in her body than her mouth. Just give her a few dry herbs. They're easier to clean. Eric asked if Maleka and Adadil herbs had always been her attendants. Misa said there had originally been 5, but now only 2 remained. Eric's face hardened, and he said they sounded very disrespectful. Misa flinched for a moment, grabbed his hand, and said that if both got hurt, Vermule would know. He realized Vermule was the emperor's name before coronation. Seeing her hands shaking, he quickly changed the subject, and said her speech had improved a lot in just a few days of practice. She insisted she'd always been good, she just hadn't practiced. He asked why not, and Misa said that when she tried to practice at night, as soon as she started to get out of bed, he threw himself on her. Since he was much stronger, she couldn't do anything. Embarrassed, Eric said he hadn't realized he'd only been worried she might leave the room. From now on, she could practice freely. As an apology, Misa asked for another kiss on the forehead like last time. He was caught off guard for a second, then kissed her forehead just as she wanted. As Misa rubbed the spot, Eric asked if she was some kind of informant, since she always made sure to get something in return. Around that time, as she grew used to speaking, her questions started multiplying. Often Misa asked basic things she somehow didn't know, and other times she asked difficult questions with no easy answer. As their talks piled up day by day, Misa's speech became strikingly natural. Lying in bed, Misa said she learned so fast because she'd always known the words already. She said them in her head all the time. Suddenly Eric kissed her and said that now he wanted her to fix her overly formal way of speaking. She asked why, and he said they were husband and wife, so they should speak casually to each other. Misa said she didn't understand. She was royal blood, and he at best was only a marquise's son, so why should he be informal? She was above him? Hearing that, Eric burst into helpless laughter, then said that after marrying him, she was basically a regular noble now too. Misa asked why, and he explained it was called a morganatic marriage, a royal marrying someone of lower rank. Eric took her hand and asked if she was disappointed. She replied that she wasn't disappointed at all. She liked staying there, so even becoming an ordinary noble was fine. He gently pressed her hand to his face and said that was a relief. Misa said she was glad she'd saved him because he was very kind, and Eric asked what she meant. She reminded him that during their last visit to the emperor, he was accused of treason. If she hadn't deceived the emperor, they'd all be at war and he'd be dead. Eric admitted that was true, but said he wouldn't dwell on it if he hadn't married her. Misa smiled and said there was lots of food there. Eric treated her well. The lady liked her too, and she liked everything there. She was truly happy to be married. Eric watched her shifting expressions and thought she was so adorable he couldn't look away. He wondered how he'd never noticed before how beautiful his wife really was. Their fingers slowly intertwined, and with eyes full of wonder, Misa looked at Eric with desire. In a soft, gentle voice, he asked her to close her eyes. When he saw she was nervous, Eric drew back from her lips and told her again to close them slowly. He brushed her lips lightly while Misa watched him anxiously. Then she slowly closed her eyes, just like he asked. Eric leaned in to kiss her, but the corners of her mouth were tense, so he murmured for her to relax. Then he kissed her tenderly. What should have been brief lasted longer, and what should have been one kiss became several. Eric clasped her hand tightly, unable to control his desire as it kept growing. At the same time, Misa also grabbed a fistful of his shirt while he kissed her. At first, the kisses were soft and gentle, but Misa found it strange. It wasn't like she had food in her mouth, so why was he devouring her mouth like that? They finally pulled back to breathe a little, and Eric looked at her tenderly to see what her expression was. Misa's eyes were wide, her hand clutched his sleeve, and her face showed both shame and confusion as she tried to understand why she felt so strange. Seeing that, Eric couldn't stop laughing. Somehow, she was unbearably cute. He kissed her forehead while calling her name, then softly kissed Misa's cheek with wet lips. Smiling gently at her, he asked if it felt strange. Before she could answer, Eric kissed her again. She shuddered and cried out when her husband bit her neck. Then Misa jolted when his lips traveled lower, reaching her breasts. She pushed his face away and told him to wait. This wasn't right. Did he even know how to do it properly? Had he ever tried before? Then she declared that he clearly hadn't, because that wasn't how it was done at all. Whatever he was doing with the upper part of his body was completely irrelevant. Misa added that she'd learned from a priestess, so she knew perfectly well he should just do what she said. She said that he never did it before because it is not how it is done. It is completely irrelevant what he does with the upper part of his body. Misa also commented that she learned with a priestess, so she knows very well just do what she says. Eric kissed her hand and said he understood. He was only trying to make this painful process less agonizing. Misa insisted that wasn't right and that he must have learned wrong, but Eric told her if she kept this up they'd never get anywhere because that was all she knew how to do. He kissed her body again while Misa begged him to stop being stubborn and listen, saying it was all for his own good. Eric asked how this was for his own good, then said he was moved by her earnest concern, so maybe he should stay like this longer. After all, he didn't want to hurt his kind wife. Misa said none of that made any sense, and Eric admitted he really did feel for her sometimes. He lunged at her again and said he'd better stop talking now. The next morning, the servants stared at Misa in confusion. The princess had just woken up covered in marks, and they wondered whether it was intentional or not. Malika asked if her mood was better today, maybe thanks to her new personal maid. Meanwhile, Misa thought that in the end he'd wasted the whole night kissing her body for no reason. She hadn't expected this man to know so little about intimacy, and if this kept up in the future, it would be a problem. Just then, Jelly came into the room, and the servants looked at her with contempt. Jel told her lady that luckily she had extra clothes for her to change into today, since the clothes from yesterday still hadn't dried yet. Then Jel noticed something on Misa's body and asked what it was. When had she gotten hurt? Looking closer, she realized what the spots really were and screamed. Meanwhile, Eric heard from Edel that they didn't seem willing to replace Madame Maleka easily. He asked why, saying there seemed to be something more behind it. Edel said he almost dug deeper but stopped halfway, afraid of drawing suspicion. He added that it was strange since she didn't seem to have any special ability. From what he'd found, Madame Maleka had a history of theft and was even caught trying to steal valuables in the imperial palace. She barely kept her post by bribing a maid, so the fact that they still refused to replace her was highly suspicious. Edel handed over an envelope and said that in the course of following Madame Maleka's case, Lady Mayne, the Viscountess, had quietly kept winning the maid's favor through gifts. Apparently the maid was so extravagant that tracking the details was easy. She said the envelope contained a list of jewels Lady Mayne had given her, and Eric praised Edel for the good work. As he looked through the documents, Edel hesitated, so Eric told her not to make a big issue of it. He said it was just a gift from the Viscountess. Indeed, a gift from the Viscountess herself. Meanwhile, the Viscountess had a twig caught on her nose and kept swaying to shake it off. Nearby, Gela muttered that this wasn't right. How could this be happening? It made no sense. Treating someone almost like a child that way, for God's sake. She wondered if the commander had finally gone mad. Turning to Misa, she told her that if she hated what the commander did, she should scratch and bite him. She'd be fine anyway. Misa felt awkward, thinking this might be necessary if he kept doing such unnecessary things. As she dug a hole with a stick, Gela kept grumbling that she ought to tell someone, but since they were a married couple, no one would stop him. Gela looked at her and said that until now she'd always thought her younger sister was the most pitiful person in the world, but now she wasn't so sure. After all, her little sister Julia was like her young lady. Then Gela said she had 7 brothers, and with her that made 8 children. Families like theirs had lots of mouths to feed, but one day an epidemic hit the village, and Julia almost died. She barely survived a terrible fever, and after that she became like Misa. At the time, her father was only an assistant at the ferry, struggling to raise a sick child and 7 more children on that wage. Everyone knew that even if Julia grew up, she'd never earn enough to feed herself. Then one day, her father took Julia out for a walk, and later he came back alone. Much later, Gela learned that Julia was gone forever, taken somewhere she could never return from. She was still too heartbroken to talk about it, and people who hadn't lived through something like that only made sarcastic remarks. Misa thought that meant it was common for families to kill one another. It seemed she'd learned something new again. Gela said she usually only told these things to horses in the stable or passing dogs, and thanked Misa for listening to her story. Strangely, Misa felt happy. She'd often been called a rat or monkey, but being compared to a horse or dog this time somehow wasn't so bad. She smiled brightly while Gela watched her with sad eyes for a long moment, still staring at her lady. Then Gela said that when she first saw her, she definitely... Misa listened closely, waiting to hear what she was going to say. But she jumped when Eric arrived, asking if this was where his wife was. He asked whether she had done a lot today, then ordered Gela to leave at once. Eric asked if she had anything else to say. Gela answered no, then told Misa she'd see her tomorrow. After Gela left, Eric asked if Misa had been having fun, but she didn't answer. He gently lifted her hair to see her face, and Misa wore a serious expression. She was upset because she wanted to know what Gela had meant after saying certainly. So she told Eric he didn't need to come get her anymore. Startled, he asked what she meant by that. Eric asked if she disliked him coming for her, and Misa quickly said no, that wasn't it. She just wondered if it was really fine for her to take her time when he was so busy. She added that when she was with Eric, people stayed quiet, so she couldn't gather information from the mansion's servants. But when she went out with Gela, they talked about all kinds of things, and it was a lot more fun. Eric said fine, he understood now, but Misa could tell from his face that he wasn't very happy. He said that if she was going out with Gela, she should at least wear proper clothes first. She changed often enough already, but this was a bit much. Eric asked if there was some specific reason they kept making her wear clothes of such poor quality. Misa thought about that while he said he wanted to see her in at least a better fabric. There was a reason. The original plan was that if the Cladnir family saw she was being treated as insignificant, they wouldn't view her as a threat and would reveal their true faces sooner. Even so, they still addressed her with honorifics every time, which must have been their way of preserving resentment toward her. Misa replied that it was fine. She had to keep acting strange anyway, since she planned to dig under the tree and use magic again tomorrow, and she didn't want to ruin good clothes. Inwardly, she decided not to tell him any of this. She had to watch her words and actions carefully because she wanted to avoid saying anything that might provoke her brother for no reason. Eric took her hand and said that in that case she should change into even softer fabric, and from now on bring tools. She was not to dig with her bare hands again. Misa looked at him. It was the first time someone had respected what she was doing and recognized how important it was to her. Eric brushed his fingers gently over her face and said she was a little sunburned, but she looked healthier now, which was good to see. When they first met, he'd worried because she looked so pale and fragile, but now she had become much more lively. Misa thought she truly loved the smell of grass under the bright noon sun, and only hoped her brother wouldn't interfere with this peaceful new life again. Suddenly, Eric glanced back and saw someone approaching. He told Misa the gardener was here. She quickly went back to digging with her stick, while Eric asked the gardener if he checked the new nest every day. The man said yes. He watched the trees so the birds wouldn't be disturbed when they built nests there. Eric said he was working hard as always, and the man thanked him for the praise. The gardener rubbed his head like something was worrying him, then turned around and left. Misa asked Eric if he knew that person. Every time she dug there, he got angry, so she thought he really hated seeing her dig in the ground. Eric replied that if she dug that deep under a tree, no gardener in the world would like it. Misa thought that even when he answered her gentle comments so firmly, his words never really hurt her. Eric added that if the gardener ever spoke rudely to her over it, he would punish him for that. Misa kept thinking that instead, Eric seemed like a prince from a fairy tale, merciful, fair, and wise above all else. Eric stood and offered her his hand, saying it was getting hotter, so they should go inside now. That night, while they lay embracing in bed and he kissed Misa's neck, Eric asked which of the things he did for her she liked most. Misa didn't answer. She only thought that he was doing it again tonight with those strange, unnecessary games. If only he did things properly and listened to what she wanted, that would be better. Gripping his shirt, Misa finally said she liked it when he held her on his lap and carried her around. Eric bit her neck, making her whole body tremble, and asked why she liked that. Misa still didn't answer. She just kept wondering why he insisted on doing this, why he had to keep suffering like this alone. When he realized she wasn't responding, Eric pushed her away, leaving her completely confused. Then he said firmly that he would wait until she answered, no matter how long it took. Misa was stunned. If she failed to answer this question properly, would he really never touch her again? It was a deadly difficult situation with no way around it. She finally answered, walking tires her legs, and if she puts pressure on them too long, they cramp. So she likes it when he carries her. Misa still didn't get why he needed her reason so badly, and wondered whether that kind of logic really mattered when death could be at stake. Earlier, the servants had whispered that maybe another lover had changed Eric's heart, and that had nothing to do with her. So Misa wondered if this was some change of heart, then suddenly moved close and stared at him, catching him off guard. She asked if they were lovers. Eric didn't understand, so Misa explained that a man and a woman become lovers when there's something special between them. Then she asked whether he and she shared something special, and he answered that they were married, not merely lovers. Looking uneasy, Misa asked if he'd take another lover while still married to her, and Eric asked whether the servants had filled her head with strange things again. Holding her face, he said some married people do keep relationships with others, but he is not one of them. There will be no other special woman besides her, and he hopes she won't keep another man as her lover either. As he was about to continue, he remembered his father telling him as a child that breaking chastity isn't just lust, it also means giving up trust. Back in the present, Misa felt him draw her body tightly against him, and she tried to look up and ask what he was doing. But before she could, Eric gently pressed a finger to her lips and asked whether she learned that accent back home in Dayela. She turned her eyes away and said she thought so, then asked if he found it strange. Smiling, he told her it was cute. They kissed again, hotter this time, full of more want and urgency, and Eric brushed kisses over Misa's dress before moving down to kiss her body and her breasts. Misa thought the ritual should only take a few minutes, yet this was nothing like the nuptial night process the priestess had described. Even so, all these seemingly unnecessary acts kept stirring strange emotions in her, which only confused her. The next day, the maids asked her to stand still a moment so they could preserve this adorable image of the young lady wearing a babador. Jella squealed that it was so cute and asked if they had made it, and the maids happily said yes. Misa started chewing on the babador, and Jella begged her not to. Please, it made her look as cute as a fairy. At the kitchen entrance, Eddie watched the whole scene with clear disapproval. The day before, Eric had asked what she meant. She replied that blind, unquestioning devotion to the family head isn't real loyalty, and she could only say he was on the wrong path as well. Eric told her to say exactly what she meant and stop circling the point. She pressed her lips together, struggling to speak, then after a pause, said it was time he took a lover and turned his attention away from the princess. He asked if she was really telling him to sleep with a woman he didn't want. What kind of loyalty was that? She admitted that, honestly, she didn't understand him at all. He had handed knightly matters to young Master Ambrick, and still kept spending time with the princess. Then she asked what kind of affection he could possibly be sharing with someone he couldn't even communicate with, and why he was creating chances for outsiders who were eyeing the successor position. She said he only seemed concerned with replacing those Imperial Palace employees, and asked why he wasted himself on a woman who spent all day doing nothing, while neglecting her duties just to care for the princess. And just yesterday, she dug up the moods in the garden for fun, hardly someone worth his time. Adil said bluntly he was distracted by an immoral woman and yet was only focused on replacing those useless employees. The whole situation made her deeply anxious. Eric fell silent for a moment, then asked if she had been the one saying something seemed strange about the maid Maleka. He turned to Cullen and asked whether he had really neglected so much while spending time with his wife, beyond the night's training. Cullen said not at all. In fact, the commander had recently solved the food shortage in the territory by delivering all the scrap metal taken in war spoils to Marquis Atal, who gratefully sent back enough food for several years. Iron is scarce in Idal, a land known for its wide plains and strong agriculture. We, meanwhile, have 2 mines besides the Alec iron mine, and our forges don't even have enough workers to repair our own weapons. On top of that, since Mr. Ambrick took over night training, his standing with the knights has dropped badly. So after every session, they compare him to the commander more and more, until nearly all of them say the commander is the more suitable choice. Eric said that was enough, then told Edil to speak if anything else troubled her. She turned cold hearing him say she was in a critical position now and must not waver. She answered that she had only exaggerated. Now she saw he had watched over everything, so she would no longer judge him and apologized. Back in the present, Misa softly bit the babador while Edil watched and thought that at this crucial time with succession so near, he was always at that woman's side, even neglecting her training. To Edil, it was all because that foolish woman had clouded his judgment. Gela noticed the head maid had arrived and greeted her, then asked if she didn't want to admire the little miss, who was so adorable. Edil only smiled without any real expression. She thought even the lady had fallen under Misa's spell. At first, Edil assumed it was simple sympathy, but lately the woman seemed to lose reason around her, much like she once did with her daughter Lady Rose. Misa grabbed the babador, tossed it on the floor, and smiled, and the maids laughed and told her to be more careful. Meanwhile, Edel watched from a distance, wondering what she should do. Both the young master and the lady were clearly not in their right minds because of that woman. That night, Eric spilled a little water on the table to support Misa's act, while she picked up food with her hand and put it in her mouth. He looked at her just as Misa said she would like to go outside, still with food smeared around her mouth, and Eric asked why she wanted to go out. She said she'd heard in the book Gela was reading that the streets were crowded, and he asked if that meant she wanted to visit the favelas. Misa said she had also heard that the shops stood in rows without gardens, and asked whether all the commercial streets were like that. Eric paused, weighing whether taking her outside was really a good idea. With bright excitement and a sweet look, she asked if she had permission to go. She really wanted to go. After a request like that, Eric had no way to deny his wife. The next morning, as the two prepared to leave in the carriage, Taliesin asked if they were going out for a ride around the city, and Eric said yes, he only meant to take a walk. But she pointed out that Misa might panic when she woke up and think he was taking her somewhere unknown. Eric said it was fine because he would be with her, but the Duchess insisted he take Gela too. Better to have two people than one handling things. Eric said again that everything would be fine, but she pressed that even so, just in case he should still take her. He looked at his mother for a moment and realized he wasn't getting out of this, so he gave in and told Gela to come with them too. In the city square, Gela stepped out of the carriage and asked if he had really spoken to her. 3 hours later, with Misa lying on his lap, Eric said yes. He told Gela to walk around and return in 3 hours. She thought that sounded like a nice long break, though the whole thing still felt suspicious. Eric stroked Misa's hair and asked whether Gela had anything else to say. She said no, and that in 3 hours she would return. Then the carriage rolled on while Gela watched it leave. Worried, she silently wished her little lady well. Inside the carriage, Eric drew the curtains shut, leaned in, and told Misa she could wake up now. She sprang up at once and pulled the curtains open to see the city, her eyes shining the moment she saw what she'd only heard about in books. She burst out that it was wonderful. Eric said this was the busiest street, and Misa answered that there were so many people here, just like Gela said. He pointed out the white building on the hill, the temple where they had their ceremony, and asked if she remembered it. Misa looked that way, then said she didn't because that day she had been sedated. Eric thought she'd probably never gone outside sober until now, and she was so thrilled that he asked her to calm down a little. So she settled onto his lap and stared at everything she'd never seen before. To Eric, these were ordinary sights, but to Misa they looked unbelievably marvelous. He found himself wondering how the world looked through her eyes now, though it was probably better not to interrupt her. All he really hoped was that today would become a good memory for her, one she'd keep for a long time. Then something suddenly caught Misa's eye and she pointed at it and asked Eric what it was. He said it was a cart. People sell goods from carts, though usually not the best quality. Misa asked why the quality wasn't good, then wondered whether even if it seemed poor to the Cladnir family, it might still be useful. Eric explained that quality had fallen because the young men who used to hunt and farm had been away at war for 12 years, and then all returned at once, making it hard to suddenly prepare enough food for more than 17,000 men within the quality. Misa questioned why it is not of good quality, then did another, wondering even if the quality does not seem good to the Cladnir family, if it can still be usable. Eric replied that the quality is not good, because the young people who used to hunt and cultivate land were at war for 12 years, and then they all returned at once, and it is difficult to prepare food suddenly to feed more than 17,000 men within the... Eric realized Misa had seriously misunderstood things. After sitting on his lap and secretly reading documents all this time, she seemed to think the Cladnir family was in poor financial shape. That was hard to picture. She sometimes struggled with simple words and still asked basic questions, yet somehow she had been trying to read complicated documents. Still, when all her standards come from the royal palace, the misunderstanding made sense, especially with the added issue of the food shortage. Eric explained that the war had reduced merchant trade, tax revenue had dropped sharply, and for a while there really was a lack of surplus funds, but that problem was already solved. Now everyone had returned to work, so after this harvest season there should be no more trouble. Misa looked impressed, and Eric figured she either had a very deep misunderstanding or still felt something didn't add up. So he added that his parents simply dislike luxury, which is why there isn't much of it at home, and that the Cladnir family now controls 3 iron mines in the territory. Trade also continues through the northern seaports, and the blue fox fur found only in the borderlands is one of their main sources of income. Then he suddenly stopped. After a brief silence, he told Misa to forget what he had just said. She asked why, and Eric immediately wondered what he was even doing. The more he talked, the more it felt like he was bragging about his wealth just to impress his wife. So he told her it was nothing, that he hadn't meant to make her worry, and asked whether anything had felt uncomfortable during her stay at the mansion. Misa said no, nothing was uncomfortable. She had only thought there was a food shortage, so she'd been saving her snacks little by little. Eric stared at her in disbelief, as she added that if she had known, she would have eaten freely. A few minutes later, he got out of the carriage and told the driver to guard the carriage door. He made it clear that under no circumstances was the man to open it, and the servant assured him there was nothing to worry about. Inside, Misa lay quietly, thinking about what Eric had said a few minutes earlier. He had told her there was a confectionery near the intersection, and that he'd pick out things she might like, but until then, she had to stay silent inside the carriage. Misa thought how foolish she had been to assume his family was poor. Even she found it funny. After all, the place she had lived was the small palace of Celia, and her only memories were of being dragged from there to the central palace. Even so, her standards had always stayed high. She had been treated worse than an animal, yet she still clung to the pride of being royal. Without it, she felt she would have nothing in the future, yet the peaceful life she had hoped for only came after she stopped being royalty. From the marriage she had feared so much, Misa never would have expected such a calm daily life. Suddenly she flinched when someone shouted that the carriage bore the coat of arms of the Cladnir family. She quickly shut the curtains and nervously wondered what was happening. Outside, people were saying he had already gone into the shop. He was unbelievably handsome, and they had never seen him this close before. Misa wondered why everyone was talking about Eric. Then a woman said this was his first time appearing in the capital, his first public appearance as an adult, so of course people would stare. Looking like that, how could he not become the subject of rumors? Young Master Cladnir was completely unlike the other prominent nobles. Misa wondered if they meant he was so extraordinary that rumors were unavoidable. The gossip kept going. He was handsome, dazzling, almost too breathtaking to look at. The princess listened to them and realized everyone spoke of him favorably. Then a boy said he'd heard from his father that if Eric hadn't changed things at the last moment, they might have lost the war. Their hometown could have become a sea of flames, and just thinking about it was terrifying. So that was it. He was the hero of victory. Now Misa understood why people cheered so warmly for him. Their faces were full of one thing, admiration. Somewhere in the crowd, one woman asked another if she knew about it, and whether it was really true. The other quickly shushed her. Talking about that could get her accused of blasphemy. Still, she admitted she had accidentally heard something about the princess. Misa listened closely as the woman said it made sense now why security had been so tight on the wedding day. Even under those conditions, the national wedding had gone ahead. She said she couldn't believe that the heir of such a noble family had been given someone like that for a wife. Eric returned to the carriage carrying a box, and the moment he appeared, something struck Misa. Even in a crowd applauding him, the dark, gloomy expressions of two people stood out. Those were the expressions she knew best. Why was it always her who received those looks whenever she was with Eric? She closed the curtains, feeling as if something invisible had slammed into her head. Eric climbed back in and asked if she had waited long, adding that the sudden crowd had worried him. Misa noticed there wasn't a trace of agitation on his face. He must be used to that kind of welcome. As he sat down, he said he had ended up with a large box because he chose many things. While he opened it, Misa thought that all those looks, every one of them, were only because of him. She didn't want to admit it, but for her this marriage had been deeply satisfying. For him, though, it must have been a terrible tragedy. She pitied him and regretted that, because of her, he'd likely lost the chance for a proper marriage with someone he loved, someone people accepted. But if people felt sorry because she had ruined his life, then who felt sorry for her, who had lived like a plague until now? Who watched her mother and the family she loved be killed before her eyes? Who pitied her for being treated like an animal all this time? Who felt sorry for her in this situation? Eric said the shop had recommended this one. In the South, they eat a pie with cream and salt on top, called a furret pie, or something like that. The words horrified Misa. She quickly turned away and said she didn't want it, didn't like sweets, and wouldn't even open the box. At the same time, she hated herself. Why was she like this, making someone else miserable and ignoring his feelings? Surely now he would be angry. Instead, he calmly said something must have happened while he was gone. Slowly, she turned back toward him as Eric asked what had happened. She thought of those eyes again, those piercing eyes. She shouted that she had already said she didn't like it, but Eric took her chin and made one thing clear. It didn't matter whether she ate sweets. What mattered was that her behavior was completely different from before. So he was asking what happened while he was away. Misa breathed hard. Eric meanwhile said he hadn't been observing her for long, but she was far more lucid than he'd expected. Inwardly, she begged him to stop. It would be easier if he yelled at her or simply ignored her. But he went on. Usually she wasn't demanding and didn't act without reason. So if there was something she couldn't even bear to look at, then there had to be a reason. Misa wondered why he kept seeing through her, trying so hard to understand, until her mind seemed to shatter like glass. Her chest tightened, she started suffocating, and though Eric called to her in alarm, Misa couldn't breathe. Then she collapsed in his arms. Now seated on Eric's lap, Misa wondered what she was doing. On impulse, she had pretended to faint. What was wrong with her? No matter how tightly she tried to hold herself together, he was still the only one who knew all her secrets. She needed his cooperation, yet kept acting like a child. She had grown too used to being treated with kindness and affection, and realized she was developing unnecessary feelings and pride. Misa thought how foolish she was. Somehow she had to get along with him no matter what. She lifted her face to see his expression, thinking that once they got home, she'd smile at everything he said, and maybe then something would work out. But the moment she saw Eric's face, her thoughts stopped. She lowered her eyes again, frightened by his expression. He usually looked severe, but lately he had always seemed gentle with her. Then Gela opened the carriage door and announced she was back, only to notice Misa curled up in Eric's arms. She quietly stepped in, thinking that if he really were some creature of darkness, he looked furious enough to prove it. Then Gela asked why all the curtains were shut. Eric looked outside and saw that the busy city center from earlier was now deserted. It seemed more time had passed than he thought. Back at the Cladnir mansion, their carriage returned from the outing while another was preparing to leave. Count Margrave was just about to depart when he saw his son and the princess arriving. They faced each other in silence and said nothing. Eric figured his father was probably going to meet her again today. He let out a faint sigh, told Gela he would get down first, and ordered her to bring the box. At that moment, he remembered what Edel had once said, that loyalty which blinds the head of the family is not true loyalty. Watching his father leave, Eric wondered why those words had come back to him now. The Count didn't even greet him anymore, and at times that phrase seemed to haunt him. Every decision for the family should be rational, built on solid judgment, but he now wondered whether his father was truly fulfilling his role as head of the family. Maybe Edel's words held some truth. Sometimes the rotten parts have to be cut away. He turned when Gela called to him. She said there was a box from a high-class confectionery in the carriage and asked whether she should take it to her room. Eric said she could keep it, then told Gela to bring it along now. Gela handed him the tray, and right after that, her commander asked if she knew how to use a dagger. She paused, feeling like she should say no, but lying to the captain seemed worse, so she admitted she could use one well enough. Eric said that was good and left with the tray, while Gela kept wondering what that meant. At the same time, two servants watched them from the mansion's second floor. Maleka muttered that it was strange looking at them. They really didn't seem like lovers. The other servant asked why not. Maybe she was his type. Otherwise, why would he take her out with that crazy woman? Deary told Maleka to look. He was even secretly giving her a gift. Maleka watched Gela leave with it, then said it didn't matter. If she wasn't his lover, they just needed to find one for him. In the room, Misa was lying in bed while Eric sat beside her. She looked peacefully asleep, and he watched her for a moment, but when he reached to stroke her hair, Misa suddenly startled. Eric apologized, saying he hadn't realized she was really asleep, then gently told her not to worry and to go back to sleep. He said he'd take care of things until dinner. Just then, she caught his hand and nervously asked if he was angry with her. Misa pulled his hand to her face so he would pet her. Then, thinking he wanted to know about her, she explained that her mother was actually from the south, from Orit, and apologized in advance. Eric said that meant she was the third queen, the last king's final wife, and Misa said yes. Unlike the other queens, she came from a humble background. Sadly, the king died a day after the birth of her first child. Left behind, she lived quietly in Saria Palace with her newborn daughter, nearly invisible to everyone, until Vermuel grew up and killed his maternal uncle Salakasi. He turned the imperial palace into a bloodbath, so very little is known about the last queen. Eric asked if that meant she hated everything tied to that region, and Misa said yes while leaning into his caress from him. Eric admitted he'd done something unnecessary, so he asked her to tell him more about herself, what she likes most, and what she dislikes. He said it would help her too, because then he could avoid hurting her by mistake. Misa answered that everything was fine and thanked him very much. Then Eric asked if anything else was bothering her. Misa grew tense as she listened, and he asked why she'd suddenly been angry with him earlier. She looked away instead of meeting his eyes, then only replied that it was nothing else. Eric asked what she meant by that, but before he could continue, he heard Misa snoring and looked at her. He couldn't believe it. This time she was clearly pretending to sleep so she wouldn't have to say more. Still, he hadn't expected her to lower her guard at night anyway. So he pinched her nose to stop the act, thinking it was fine if she still hadn't fully opened up to him. But something about her kept bothering him. From what he'd seen, Misa avoided things. Even deeply buried memories seemed to be brushed aside, and she didn't seem aware of it herself. If so, what happened in the carriage might be a sign. Eric had grown up on battlefields and seen countless survivors and deaths. Even trained adults often broke under the aftermath. Misa was usually so composed and sometimes shameless that he overlooked it, but maybe the emotions Misa had been bottling up for so long would explode one day. Several days later, lying in bed, she said dinner had been delicious and asked if that was pork rind, then added that she wanted to eat it again. Eric said fine, she should tell the cook. Then he noticed Misa was anxiously waiting for something, so he leaned in and kissed her on the forehead. Misa said the sunlight had been very strong today, so she couldn't play outside long. Clear weather was nice, but she hated not being able to stay in the garden for very long. She shut her eyes expectantly as Eric leaned closer to kiss her, but he only gave her a quick kiss instead. Meanwhile, he couldn't settle his restless thoughts. That first pull toward the opposite sex was more confusing than anything. Unsatisfied, Misa asked if that was all. He asked if there was anything else she wanted to talk about, pointing out that everything she'd said so far was something she could tell anyone. Turning away, Eric thought that even if she broke things or lashed out, protecting and caring for her was his responsibility. That wasn't the problem. The problem was this unfamiliar feeling he couldn't control, the one that kept making him draw a line because he didn't know where it would lead. Misa tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Then she looked at him and giggled, saying she didn't know what to talk about with anyone else, or even what kind of conversation people were supposed to have in a situation like this. After all, he was the only person she talked to. Eric covered his face, thinking how stupid he was and wondering why he was overthinking someone who choked up whenever she got nervous. Then he moved closer and asked if they shouldn't talk about their last outing. Something clearly happened that day. He hadn't pushed because she didn't want to explain, but if she kept it inside and went on dwelling on it, she'd only keep struggling with tangled, confusing feelings. The fact that she couldn't hide those feelings from him seemed like a good sign. She'd probably hidden them perfectly from everyone else until now. Misa asked why he was so kind to her, why he treated her so well. Normally, people treated her like an animal, but he never did. Eric said he never would, and reminded her that she was now part of the Cladnir family. When Misa asked what that meant, he told her it meant they were a family now. Misa asked if that was true, and Eric said yes. Since they were family, she could rely on him and share her real feelings whenever she wanted. Eric said he only asked for two things. First, she had to stay loyal to him. That was very important. Second, she had to remember they were on the same side. Just as he was, she had to be as well. Misa agreed, imagining a chain binding the two of them to each other. Eric smiled and said that maybe family meant something different to each of them for now, so they should wait until one day those meanings matched. He kissed her again, warm and gentle, and said she must be tired, so she should sleep now. Misa thought she'd felt safe like this for quite a while, and that Eric always seemed to explain himself sincerely. His kindness didn't feel like an act. Maybe he really was a genuinely good person. The next morning, Eric said he was heading out, and Misa smiled happily in his arms while Talion told him to be careful, and wished Misa a good time today too. Edel watched the scene with a hard expression, and after they left, asked the lady if it was really wise to keep such a young woman so close to him, since the young master was still a man. The Duchess asked what she was implying, and Edel said it would be better to assign a respectable young woman from a good family as maid to the princess. Telizin asked if Edel still thought Gela and Eric were having an affair, even after seeing how they actually interacted, and was still stuck on that. Besides, with Misa as his wife, it didn't matter who was brought in, Eric wouldn't care. After all, everyone, including Edel, could see Misa had filled out recently and was becoming more and more beautiful. There wouldn't be another like her. Edel stared at her lady in disbelief while the Duchess told the servants to find out what Misa liked to eat. She'd only just realized Misa liked butter. That night, Eric was reading the documents he'd received earlier when he picked up one reporting that the servant had been seen visiting a shop today. He leaned back, wondering if she was finally making a move. She'd been quiet lately, and nothing had come from Crispin's side either. Then he noticed Misa had gotten out of bed and was staring at him. Eric asked if she couldn't sleep. She said nothing and kept watching, so he asked if she wanted to sit on his lap like before. Misa said no, she wanted to talk about where she stood. After hesitating, she admitted she'd been thinking. Eric asked about what, then froze at her answer and asked in disbelief if that meant she hadn't liked him before. Misa said yes, but now she didn't dislike him anymore. He stood and started walking toward her, wondering if after all that thought she'd finally reached the point where she simply didn't dislike him. Misa asked nervously if he was angry, and Eric said he wasn't. Then he asked whether she hadn't liked him before, and whether his touch made her uncomfortable. Misa stayed quiet for a long time, then said no. Eric let out a breath, thinking she had to take that long to answer, while he himself had somehow managed to answer smoothly the last time she asked why he was kind to her. Misa said she wasn't uncomfortable, she just thought it was unnecessary. Eric said he understood, and that it made sense. Taking her hand, he told her he was glad she didn't dislike it or find it uncomfortable. Misa looked openly pleased and proud when Eric thanked her for reporting such a great achievement so quickly. She said it was nothing, while Eric thought her face was incredibly easy to read. She was obviously proud. Then Misa looked at the table and asked what he had been doing before. Eric said he only had a few things to check, and seeing how curious she was, told her she could take a look if she wants. Misa quickly went to the table, and Eric warned her not to touch the stack on the left or tear anything. Then he froze. Her eyes flew over the page in seconds, her focus razor sharp. It was the first time he'd seen her read, and she looked far more at ease with text than with conversation. Then Misa asked if he was watching the imperial servant Maleka. Walking over, Eric said yes. Misa then asked what all this talk about Salakez was, and whether that family wasn't insignificant now. Eric explained that one illegitimate child of the last patriarch apparently survived, and was reported to have claimed the family legacy. Misa blurted out that it was impressive, then said she'd seen all she wanted. Eric could only think, as usual, that she was hard to read. Misa asked if he'd show her again sometime, and he said whenever she wanted. Then she asked if he still had work left. After a pause, Eric said he thought so. Then he looked up just as she said she'd like to sit on his lap. He told her to go ahead, though there might be nothing interesting for her. Misa said that was fine and slipped her arms around his neck, then asked Eric whether kissing was something that should only happen in bed. Thinking it over now, Misa said maybe it wasn't just that she didn't dislike him, maybe she really liked him, so why don't they? Instead of answering, Eric pushed her face back lightly with the tip of his finger. Brushing her lips, he asked what that was supposed to mean, then without letting her answer, tipped her back in his arms and admitted very plainly that his acting skills were getting very weak. Misa stared at him, excited, while Eric told her to say clearly what he wanted to hear. Serious now, he asked what she'd been thinking about alone this time, to suddenly say that just now, Misa said she'd only shared a major achievement from today, and was trying to get the answer he'd promised her. Like usual, Eric said fine, that really was an important topic she'd brought up. Before Misa could say more, he kissed her. The sudden move stunned her, but she wrapped her arms around his neck as the kiss deepened, growing hotter and more intense. She got so bold that this time she was the one taking the lead, which caught Eric a little off guard. When they finally pulled apart, Eric asked if that was really the only reason. Misa said this was to save him. Had he forgotten what happened at the palace? If he kept avoiding it, the Emperor would definitely act. Eric cut her off and said that wouldn't happen. The Emperor had already let them go once, so he wouldn't punish them again for the same reason. Misa's eyes widened. She asked if that meant he wasn't worried and why. Eric said that if the Emperor did that, he'd be admitting his earlier judgment was wrong. Misa could hardly believe it. So that was why he'd been so calm this whole time, while she alone had been restless. Eric asked if that settled it, but Misa told him to wait. If he was going to be killed by the king soon for some other reason, then she had something to confirm before he died. Her chances of another marriage this good were low. She pulled open his blouse, startling Eric, then tried to undo more buttons. When she couldn't, she decided one must be broken. Eric was clearly uncomfortable with what she was doing, so he asked why she was doing this. Misa slapped his hand away and flustered, asked if there always had to be a reason. She demanded that he be honest for once and just say it already, that he simply doesn't do this with her because he doesn't like his body. Upset, she asked if he couldn't just ignore that by closing his eyes. So why couldn't he do even that? She'd promised herself she'd only smile gently in front of him, but she couldn't understand why these useless emotions kept coming out. Eric snapped, asking what the hell she was saying. He shoved her hard enough at the waist to make her yelp, then yanked the cord holding Misa's shirt. Looking down at his wife, he demanded again, if she was going to claim he didn't like it, then take off your body. He threw her onto the bed while Misa repeated what she'd heard from the imperial servants, that her body wouldn't please him, that she had too many scars, that she was thin and unattractive. In front of her, Eric started unbuttoning his shirt. Misa could only think that everyone called him the most handsome man. When he took it off, she was stunned by his broad shoulders, muscular chest, and defined waist. He looked even more imposing half undressed. He braced one hand beside her, and that alone made her shiver with nerves. Hovering over her, Eric pointed out that she had many scars, but as she could see, he had plenty too, as many as she did. Misa gently traced them with her fingers and asked who gave them to him. Eric said one was left by the city commander in the final moments of the war. Then he showed another and said a traitor gave him that one with an axe years ago. Misa was more overwhelmed by the size of him than by his scars. Looking at her, Eric asked what she thought. How would it feel if your wife didn't like your body? Misa turned her eyes away instead of facing him, and admitted that she liked it. Eric said that was a lie. She just looked away. Still, he added with satisfaction that she seemed willing to overlook that. Then he bent down and gently bit her collarbone, making Misa cry out. Her legs trembled, her body curled in on itself from the strange burning feeling, and odd little sounds kept slipping from her mouth before she even noticed. Eric kissed her body softly, and Misa thought that not minding his constant kisses only made her feel even stranger. She pressed her lips tight to stop the sounds again, but when he gently bit her breasts, that whole part of her body shook with a strange tingling. Misa tried to steady her breathing, yet every time he touched and bit her there, she couldn't stop those sounds from escaping her mouth. Eric lay down beside her and said she seemed to like it more than expected. Misa looked at him, wanting more, while her body kept growing hotter. Eric kissed her again, and she closed her eyes to sink into the feeling. Then he took her thigh and lifted it, gently telling her to relax. But Misa jolted in surprise when he slid his fingers down there and, nervously embarrassed, said no, not yet. Eric answered softly that he knew it wasn't time yet, kissing her breasts. He said that even so, he only meant to prepare her today. Misa looked at him gently, thinking that even now he was still so respectful and gentle. Then Eric warned that from now on, she shouldn't be too surprised by anything he did. Even if she didn't like it, she wasn't allowed to tell him to stop. Misa said everything was fine. Eric kissed his way down her body again, from the lips of her mouth to the lips of the lower part of her body. The moment that happened, she instantly regretted that answer. He still didn't take the next step that night, but Misa was left with a lasting ache and a tingling in a place too hard to describe. The next day in his workroom, Eric asked whether she had gone to a pawn shop. One night said yes. She seemed to tuck something into her pocket, but it was too small to tell exactly what it was. Eric then confirmed that she returned to the mansion alone and later met her friend in front of the pawn shop where he had been waiting. The knight then asked whether Eric had received the report sent through Mordom. He added that near sunset, a rented carriage stopped in front of the pawn shop. Soon after, an old woman got out. He watched her enter, and not long later she argued over selling a brooch and then left. As a precaution, he followed her and wrote down her address. Handing over the paper, the knight said it was where the old woman lived, a small house on the outskirts. Eric studied it and thought the address seemed familiar. With that, he only needed to confirm the connection between them. The Imperial Palace staff, the Kristen family, the unknown old woman from the carriage, and her father's lover. Then Eric entered the room and found Gela reading to Misa. He thanked her for her hard work and asked whether everything was going well. Misa turned quickly, embarrassed, and asked if Gela had something to say since she seemed hesitant to speak. Gela asked whether the commander might go out with the young lady again today. He said maybe, and asked why she wanted to know. Gela explained that Imperial Palace staff had come by earlier and said something suspicious. A few hours earlier, Gela had muttered that she couldn't keep living like this. Looking at Misa, she said the young lady had been quiet for a while, yet that damned commander kept doing these things. Misa was dying of embarrassment as Gela went on that the two of them seemed to be getting along well, which was good, but she was still worried about the young lady. Maleka then asked Gela whether she would accompany the young master and the princess on today's outing too. Gela snapped that she should call her young lady. She was no longer a princess, and added that only the commander would know for sure. Malika said the princess seemed to enjoy these tours, that her complexion had improved a lot, and asked if she didn't think so. Gela was furious. She had just said Misa was now a young lady. Back in the present, Gela said that anyway they were obviously testing something, so she wondered what they were planning. Eric replied it was so obvious it almost felt like a trap, and as expected they really were planning something. He said they needed to at least pretend to take the bait. Gela asked what he meant by that. Eric then handed her a dagger with some accessories. Gela asked what kind of dagger it was, and he said Cullen would show her how to use it. Use it later. Then he told her that today she'd go out, spend time as usual, return halfway through the route, and also that Cullen would be following her, so she should keep that in mind. Gela said she'd go get ready for the tour. Listening nearby, Misa quietly wondered what was happening. A few hours later, Misa asked if this was for protection. Eric said yes, he'd stay right beside her, and the family knights would come too, but he'd feel safer if she wore it. Misa still couldn't meet his eyes after last night. Then she asked if it would protect her from knives, whips, or axes too. Eric told her not to say something so terrifying. Though with whips, it depends on whether they have extra attachments. The vest should stop knives to some extent, but not axes. Misa said she understood, and Eric warned that that was all. He asked if the armor felt uncomfortable. She said no, but she still needed to put on that, pointing to the stinger on the floor. Misa explained that she wears it around her neck like a necklace, then ties the ribbon behind her back. Eric wondered if that was really a ribbon. It looked more like a stinger. He'd seen her use it a few times lately, and then he looked up at her. Misa was dazzling. Sunlight only made her natural beauty brighter, and those vivid blue eyes left Eric staring at his wife. He gave a small cough and said he wasn't sure he could tie it properly, but he'd do his best. Even so, he hoped all this preparation would be unnecessary. Just as he wished, nothing happened through the long carriage ride. The usual silence dragged on, and it seemed the tour would end peacefully. But when he met Gayla again in the square, the woman from 3 hours earlier was gone. Now she was wounded and bleeding. Furious, Gayla asked whether dangerous work came with extra pay. Eric asked if she was hurt. Gayla said yes, but what hurt most was her heart. With a dark look, he said that was because of Cullen and Aemonus. Cullen and his brother Valak both hate hearing their surname because, in the Principality's language, it sounds like something vulgar. Gayla knows that perfectly well. She said she acted just like on any other tour, looked around for herbs, bought snacks on the way to the bookstore, but then some rude man slammed into her and stole her purse. She screamed and chased the thief, only to realize too late she was being lured into a dark hole. The bastard wasn't alone. They all looked weak and pathetic, and she couldn't believe she'd fallen for such an obvious trap. Worse, their rotten teeth made them stink like open sewage. Eric told her to stop there. No need to describe the smell. Gayla said that was fine, then went on. From what she heard, they hadn't planned to hurt her there. One thug licked his knife and warned that he wasn't gentle with women, so she'd better stay still if she didn't want pain. Gayla just slapped him, thinking this one talked too much. The others stared, wondering what kind of slap that was, as the thug dropped unconscious. Then another came at her with a bag in his hands, but Gayla grabbed his head and smashed it into the ground. She told Eric they meant to kidnap her. They'd even tried to bag her head. If she'd quietly gone along, they might have led her to whoever sent them and to their hideout. But she couldn't hold back. Eric said they didn't need that. She could have gotten answers right there. Gayla agreed she knows exactly where to cut for the best results. She said there were 4 of them, but strangely, while she handled the others one by one, no one came at her from behind. So she turned and saw Cullen holding 2 men at the same time, really dragging each one his own way. Gayla couldn't believe it, and while she kept fighting, Cullen started counting. First he said 18. She thought he meant he'd help her take on that many, so she got excited. But then the count dropped from 18 to 17, then 16. Eric said Cullen must have been comparing her skill to his own at 16. Gayla said he actually explained that. Eric told her that frustrating as it was, he was praising her in his own way, then asked what happened after. Gayla said that once they'd caught everyone, Cullen had the nerve to ask, if you're going to play with them like that, why carry a dagger? She answered that she'd use his idiot during the interrogation. She added that 2 were still conscious, so she started cleaning under their nails with one quick stroke. Eric told her to wait a second, then glanced at Misa, thinking this had to be too graphic for her. But Misa had both hands over her mouth and looked oddly thrilled by what she was hearing. Eric stared at her in disbelief, wondering what that expression was, and Gela asked the same. He brushed it off and told her to continue, still puzzled by Misa's delight. Gela said she only removed a few fingers and toenails, then pulled some teeth. The men claimed they belonged to a thieves' guild, though Cullen said they'd been thrown out. Eric guessed they were disposable. Gela agreed they didn't even know who hired them, only that they'd been promised money. Their plan was to kidnap her, keep her in some isolated cabin, abuse her for months, and if she got pregnant, dump her in front of the Cladnir mansion. Eric was horrified by what he heard, but still praised Gela for handling it well and said he already had an idea who was behind it. Gela said she did too, though her wrist still hurt, and asked again about hazard pay. Eric said this wasn't something money could settle. Gela answered that she'd already taken revenge, so she had no regrets. Eric reminded her he'd heard she was saving to buy a sawmill or a house. Gayla said her father's rival was being ridiculous, so she wanted to give her father something that might ease his burden. Eric told her it would take a few weeks, but he'd pay for it himself. Gayla lit up and asked if that meant he cut in and said that by the start of next month the deed should be in her hands. She thanked him sincerely for such a gift. Then he told her to go treat her injury. Gayla left smiling, saying she'd see them tomorrow, already wondering what face Cullen would make when he learned the commander had given her something like this. After she left, Misa looked at Eric, and he said the whole scheme was brutal and absurd. They thought they could ruin them by spreading scandal if Gayla ended up pregnant. Misa then said that, speaking of that, the 2 servants had called Gayla his lover. Eric sighed and asked whether she was all right with that. She asked with what? He said with the whole story about the fight. He thought she'd hate blood in all of it. Misa said the first time she saw blood she was terrified. She was just a child, and it even came to her in dreams at night, but now she's used to it. Eric said she must have seen it many times. Misa said what worried her more back then was bursting into loud laughter. There were times she slept among piles of corpses. She was only 12 then, and people simply assumed she was insane. Since she never did anything too extreme, that actually made things easier. But around 2 years ago, the servants began wondering if Misa was coming back to her senses. By then, most of the people who were going to die had already died, so she had fewer chances to sleep among corpses. It wasn't easy having to invent new kinds of madness. Eric thought it was hard to even imagine what she'd gone through as a child, or what she might have done. Misa went on, saying that more than anything, she had done well. Whenever she acted crazy, the people who suspected her quickly shut their mouths. They all bought the performance. The fact that she talks about this so casually makes Eric wonder why she's so frightened of birds and why she refuses to enter the chapel. Plus something he still doesn't know. She's also afraid of thunder. He asked if there was anything she still hated or feared. Now, though if she didn't want to talk about it, she didn't have to. Misa said she doesn't like talking about her childhood. She doesn't want to remember it, not even the happy parts. Eric asked why. Misa said she wasn't sure it was a big secret. Then she looked at him warmly and added that hearing it would cost a very high price. After all, they hadn't exactly finished everything last night. Long ago, a woman asked if that had been the last candy, then said it hadn't. Looks like she wasn't listening again. A little girl stared at her nervous mother with a lollipop in her mouth, then jumped into one of the granny's arms and insisted she didn't know anything. Her mother told the maids not to give her anything else, no matter how much Misa complained. She walked over asking where Misa thought she was hiding, and reminded her what would happen if she didn't listen to her mother. Misa clung to her lap while her mother cheerfully warned that on rainy days, goodbye comes for children who don't listen, snatches them away like this and punishes them. The time Misa spent in the Palace of Celia during childhood held many happy memories. It wasn't as grand as the Central Palace, but there was a strict, kinder mother there, and everyone smiled warmly at her. Still, whenever the king's agent came and whispered secrets to her mother, the woman's mood darkened, and that always left Misa frightened and uneasy. The maids looked at her, told her not to worry and that she'd better go inside because it looked like rain, but that day felt especially wrong. Everyone in the Palace of Celia wore dark expressions, and then the rain came down hard like an omen. It was as if the goddess of old myths had descended to punish them. Thunder rolled through the palace, shaking the walls, and at that same moment, Vermeule attacked the Palace of Celia. Terrified, Misa heard her mother say she must have done something wrong, so even as her mother she deserved punishment if she had sinned. Misa begged to hide together because she didn't want her punished, but her mother said there was no other way. She'd likely be punished, and Misa had to survive no matter what. She told her to hide under the corpses or pretend to be crazy. It probably wouldn't last long. People were dying everywhere, screams never stopped, and Misa kept wondering why her mother said that. Maybe she believed Vermeule would eventually fall. Later, Misa came to see those words as selfish and reckless. She was only 8 with no real way to survive. Even so, she did. Misa clung to life, though she still can't believe she survived that day. At the time, she thought it was just another punishment from the goddess for not listening to her mother. After that day, life became unbearable, so she clung to her mother's final order. If she had to hide under piles of corpses or act insane, she'd do it. Those first months sleeping in the main hall were horrific. She probably wasn't sane then, and maybe that's why Vermeule spared her. For a while, she cried over her mother, but eventually even the tears dried up. Her mother had been so gentle. While fixing Misa's hair once, she said she was the one who gave her that name, begging Her Majesty for days and nights to be allowed to name her. She asked Misa to watch the shape of her mouth when she said your name. Your mouth makes a smile. She chose it hoping everyone who said it would smile, and everyone around her would surely bring happiness to Misa. But a man said that thing was called Misa? Better if it hadn't been because it was a beast, not a person. Only an animal would lick the floor before the enemy who killed its mother. He yanked her by the hair and sneered that a little rat was running around again, crossing his path and dirtying it. Then a person forced Misa to drink a medicine. She vomited at once, and a servant complained that if she spat out what she was given, she'd have to lick the floor again. Misa glared furiously at everyone in front of her. They all looked at her like an animal, and her brother, the emperor, watched without expression, until their eyes met and he gave her a frowning smile. Back in the present, Misa felt like she was drowning in a flood of sensations. Eric looked like he was holding something back, jaw clenched, while she stared at him with desire. Eric began moving more slowly, but the sounds Misa made were hard to suppress, so she scratched him when he pushed deeper. Eric was close to the apex, and Misa pressed a hand to his chest, trying to bear the pain. She put her hand over her mouth to muffle the strange sound growing stronger as he slowly pressed deeper. At last, Eric reached the apex with Misa. Her eyes were wet and she felt full inside, but it wasn't a bad feeling. Eric called her name and asked if she was okay, but Misa was so exhausted she couldn't answer. He kissed her forehead gently, her eyes fluttered, and then she fell asleep. The next morning, they were still holding each other in bed, and Eric, even after waking, kept looking at her. Just seeing her sleep peacefully in his arms filled him with joy, even if last night's conversation still left him with many questions. But for now, he only hopes last night didn't leave her with another scar. Eric kept kissing his wife, then told her to rest again because she must be very tired. Suddenly, someone knocked and asked if he was awake. The person reported urgent news from the Knights and said he should see it immediately. After saying goodbye to Misa, Eric walked out with his men. One said he'd followed the commander's orders, watched the Crispin family closely, and uncovered the old woman's identity. She was the mother of the vice commander of the Crispin Knights. Eric said he'd heard of him, a highly capable man with brutal methods, kept from becoming commander because of his plebeian birth. For generations, he'd handled the family's dirty work. His father was executed for sexual abuse and violence, but in truth, they say he took the blame for the family head's crimes. Eric wondered why they still stayed loyal to the Crispins, and the knight answered that they likely care more about the competent son's future than avenging the incompetent father. He added that the old woman also seemed tied to the Guild of Thieves. The ones who attacked Gela came from a thieves' guild called Paucia, and the old woman's brother leads it. Eric concluded this confirmed the Crispin family's involvement, but what did they gain by interfering with the marriage between the two families? They even tied a woman to her father and conspired with the royal maidens to kidnap Gela and stain his name. Was it to seize the heir's position in the Cladnir family, or bring about the fall of the Cladnir family? Questions raced through Eric's mind, but no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't see why the Crispins would go this far. He called Cullen and ordered him to bring the latest information on Crispin's movements at once. Cullen agreed immediately. Still, another thing bothered Eric. In just a few days, they'd uncovered them too easily, which made the scheme seem oddly shallow. So why was a maid's identity still so hard to trace? Their methods felt strangely inconsistent. Then a new theory formed. What if Crispin isn't the mastermind behind all this? The marriage alliance proposed by House Crispin was treason, but was that really the beginning of everything? If this was a trap from the start, then who was the real mastermind? Suddenly, a servant came running for Eric. The boy said the young lady was coughing, and he'd been told to notify him immediately. Eric said he was going to her at once, already thinking that if these people were being used, like the Cladnir family, then there was only one person who could be behind all of it. That morning, the Imperial servants looked at Misa in bed, wondering what it was, and on closer inspection, they seemed to notice the traces of last night. Misa felt embarrassed, like everyone had come to stare, but in one way that was good. Now the two of them could report properly to the king. Then Maleka told the maid to make sure everything was done correctly, saying this was the perfect time and they'd bring him right away. Misa looked up at her, wondering what that perfect time meant. In the bathroom, Maleka asked if Deal had locked the door, and she said yes. Maleka then dumped out the clothes, accessories, and jewels Misa had worn when she arrived at the Cladnir mansion. Deal asked if she'd brought everything. Maleka said yes, though it had been difficult since that woman had already left. The guards were rushed and they kept questioning everything. Then she told Deal to handle them carefully because it would be a problem if they went mad. Meanwhile, Misa wondered what they were trying to do now. Maleka came closer and said mornings would be busy from now on. With a dark look, she told Misa she couldn't afford to lose her husband's attention, leaving Misa confused and uneasy about what they were planning. Outside the room, Gela greeted Callan, Cullen's youngest brother. Callan remarked without ceremony that she was a little late today. Gela showed her bandaged arm and said that was why the morning took longer. Handling things one-handed was harder than she expected. Callan told her to hurry in because the young lady had woken early. Gala smiled and said she'd go in at once, but before opening the door, she asked if the young lady was alone. He said 2 servants were with her. Gala opened the door slowly, calling for the young lady, but she immediately sensed something was wrong. The bed was still messy, and Misa wasn't there. Jayla wondered what was happening and why she wasn't here when she suddenly turned at the sound of voices and strange noises. Jayla fixed her eyes on the bathroom door, wondering if Misa was inside. Meanwhile, makeup and perfume had been thrown across the floor. Maleka asked where she had gone after seeing what she wanted and taking it. Looking worn out, Maleka said she'd panicked when she thought it was missing, then ordered Dalis to hold Misa tighter so this mess wouldn't happen again, while Misa thought everything about this was far too strange. Maleka glanced around for something else, and once she found it, told Dalis to hold Misa firmly so she couldn't move. The servant tried to smear a strange red pigment on Misa's lips, while Misa kept wondering what this was all for, but somehow Misa managed to break free. Maleka snapped that it was impossible to apply it like this, and Dalis said it was hard to hold her because Misa had gotten stronger. The servant grabbed the small pot of red liquid and said there was no other way. She ordered Dalis to pry Misa's mouth open, and this time she couldn't fail. Misa was too weak to resist now, while Maleka said they had to finish quickly. Misa realized something was wrong. Usually they would just subdue her, but now something seemed more urgent than that. No matter how hard she thought, if she kept waiting like this, she felt something very bad would happen. Suddenly, Dalis heard knocking at the bathroom door, asking why it was locked. Maleka turned toward the voice and demanded to know why that woman was still here. In that brief moment of distraction, Misa screamed with all her strength, hoping Jayla would hear. Jayla's quickly covered her mouth, but the scream had already drawn Jayla's attention. She pounded harder and demanded they open the door, but pain shot through her arms. Since the injury was still fresh, she hadn't recovered enough strength to break it down. Then Jayla called for Callan, and the moment Maleka heard that, her face turned pale. Jayla's asked what to do if they forced the door, but with a dark look, Maleka ordered her to remove her hand. Confused, Jayla asked what she meant, and Maleka snapped that she should take it off Misa's mouth now. Misa grew even more distressed when the servant said they'd finish before anyone got in. Jayla argued Misa would scream, and maybe they should stop for today, while Misa desperately searched for some way to buy time. Maleka refused, saying they just needed a good excuse. They'd claimed Misa was making a scene, so they locked the door. Besides, ebony doors don't break easily. Outside, Jayla and Colin kept trying to force the bathroom door open, but nothing worked. Inside, Jayla obeyed Maleka and slowly lifted his hand from Misa's mouth, and Misa instantly spat in the Imperial servant's face, figuring that if she couldn't escape, the next best thing was to stall somehow. The servant recoiled in disgust and wiping her face muttered that Misa was a crazy witch, but then something caught Maleka's eye. She noticed Misa staring hard at the red stain on her fingers, visibly frightened and distressed. Maleka stepped closer and in a threatening voice asked what that expression was. Misa had no idea what was happening when the servant fixed her with a sharp stare and remarked that she was making almost a normal person's face, which was very strange. Misa dropped her eyes at once, realizing she'd made a mistake, but if she avoided eye contact now, she'd only look more suspicious, and she cursed herself for such a foolish slip. Before she knew it, her whole body was shaking, her eyes fixed on the floor as she breathed hard. A moment later, following Maleka's order, Misa slowly lifted her gaze to look at her, hoping the shivers running through her were only in her head. But the second she saw the servant's demon-like smile, she knew she'd been caught. Outside, Gala asked Callan if he could break the door, and he admitted it wasn't being affected at all. Gala quickly weighed her options. If she went for the key, it would take too long, but there was no other choice. She told Callan to keep trying while she searched for it, because even if it took time, it was the only option. Until Eric suddenly arrived, walking over calmly and asked what was going on. Gainla said something terrible had happened. Those 2 cursed maids were doing something to the young lady inside. The door was locked and they refused to open it. Eric simply ordered her to step away from the door. He kicked it and the door flew off its hinges as the wood cracked through the bathroom. Eric saw Misa being restrained by one servant while the other tried to put something on his wife. After one quick look, he ordered them seized at once. Malika desperately begged him to wait, saying there was something he needed to know, but Gayla didn't hesitate. She grabbed Malika by the hair, slammed her to the floor, and demanded to know who she thought she was to mistreat the young lady. In the middle of the chaos, Eric went straight to Misa and asked if she was all right. She turned to him when he asked whether she was hurt anywhere. Slowly, Eric reached out and pulled her into his arms. At once, Misa felt things were finally okay. In his warmth and familiar scent, she could breathe again after feeling smothered. And selfish as it was, she wanted him to hold her even tighter. Pinned to the floor under Gayla, Malika screamed for Eric to listen, begging him not to ignore such important information. But he carried Misa back toward the room without caring, until he suddenly froze in shock when Malika said this crazy thing had been perfectly fine all along. Galat looked over, confused about what that meant, and Malika kept shouting that this crazy thing had deceived everyone and only pretended the whole time. Before she could say more, Eric shot her a furious look and ordered Galat to muzzle this animal immediately. Gala moved at once, fastening the gag over her mouth. Malika struggled to break free, but Gala only held her down harder, while Eric slowly walked out of the bathroom. Holding the trembling Misa close, he softly whispered that he understood the situation now, and told her not to worry anymore. But she kept shaking because too much was racing through her mind, especially the fact that she'd been exposed. Eric also felt uneasy. If Misa's secret came out, chaos would follow. A few minutes later, he asked Gayla whether Malika had been holding something, and she said yes, probably makeup for the young lady since red pigment was on her finger. Eric smelled the strange pigment and thought back. When he entered the bathroom, there were clear signs of a violent struggle, so if Misa had resisted that hard, there had to be a reason. Gayla asked whether something was wrong with it and said that if he gave it to her, she could analyze the ingredients within 2 days. Eric repeated, 2 days? Then said they didn't need to wait that long. Gayla, confused, asked how he planned to learn its effect, so Eric walked straight to the Imperial maids. Stopping before Malika, he answered that they would use her as a guinea pig. He dabbed some of the red pigment onto his finger and asked if it was really just cosmetic. Seeing Malika's terror, he ordered them to remove the gag, and at once a rough hand forced Malika's mouth open. A sharp crack rang out as her jaw dislocated, followed by a scream of pain. With the pigment still on his finger, Eric coolly said that with her jaw broken, he wouldn't need a gag anymore. Then he shoved the red-smeared finger into Malika's unnaturally rigid mouth and ordered them to hold her jaw shut so she couldn't spit it out. To make sure she swallowed, Eric pressed the center of her throat with the tip of his finger, and her eyes rolled back the moment the red pigment went down. Seconds later, purple foam began spilling from her mouth. It thickened rapidly, then the bubbles burst and blood splattered across the floor. Malika's face twisted out of shape while the other Imperial servant watched in horror, trembling. At once, Eric ordered Gayla to check her condition. When Gayla bent down to examine Malika, her eyes had already rolled back. After checking her, Gayla said clearly and firmly that she was dead. Eric stayed outwardly calm, thinking that the angrier he got, the colder his mind became. From the circumstances, he judged they meant to poison Misa slowly. Instead of staging an accident and ending it at once, they chose a method that would take time. Sooner or later, the Cladnir family would believe it was the work of the Crispin family, and a deep rift would open between them. Eric wondered how far the Emperor had planned this. He was moving everyone like puppets. Was he accusing them of neglecting the princess, or framing the Crispin family as schemers? Maybe it didn't matter. What the Emperor wanted was the ruin of both the Cladnir and Crispin families. Eric clenched his fist in anger, thinking the Emperor was willing to sacrifice Misa just to drive those families together and against each other. Still, he wasn't surprised whether the victim was a princess or a maid. The Emperor didn't care as long as the two houses turned on each other. If that was true, Eric decided he had to play along with the performance for a while, but first he had to deal with this side of it. Turning to the other servant, he demanded to know what this meant. Trembling, she said she knew nothing and only did as she was told. With a menacing look, Eric repeated that she knew nothing, his voice thick with distrust. Then he approached slowly and said that from what he'd heard, Madame Malika had some problems. He asked if that was true, and under Eric's threatening stare, the servant couldn't hide her fear. Eric went on, saying he'd heard her father's gambling debts had grown enormous, and she'd even stolen ornaments from the Imperial Palace. When she was caught, she bribed a housemaid in Maria to cover it up. He said he thought she'd done this for money too, and asked whether the servant didn't agree. With every word and every piercing look, her panic grew, until she could no longer bear the pressure and cried out yes. Voice shaking, she stammered that she thought so too, and now that she considered it, she thought Malika had said something like that. Eric then asked whether all of this had also been orchestrated by the Crispin family, and the servant said yes. She had seen Malika meeting often with the servants of the Crispin family. Eric called Cullen and ordered him to go to the Imperial Palace at once and report that a conflict had broken out between the two families, that the Crispin family, out of greed toward the Cladnir family, had tried to harm the young master's wife. Then Eric said he would no longer use this room and ordered a room on the 3rd floor cleaned immediately. After that, he turned to Gayla and told her to examine Malika's body and analyze the drug's components, and she answered that she'd do it at once. Finally, Eric asked if his father had arrived yet. A gray-haired man replied that he had not, though they had already contacted him. Eric said to forget it, just thinking that his father was probably at his lover's house was giving him a headache. So he decided to go see Misa and his mother. For now, in the mansion's living room, Misa lies on Taliesin's lap, still furious. The lady fumes that they already let those vile comments slide, that she dropped the canvas or shouldn't have children, but this is different now. Trying to calm his worked-up mother, Eric firmly says the real issue isn't the Crispin family right now. The maid sent from the Imperial Palace is dead, so they need a witness. Taliesin asks what they need a witness for, while Ediule bites her lip, worried, thinking that maid really died and caused a huge mess, all because of the woman lying so carelessly in the lady's lap. Eric explains that people from the royal family will arrive soon, so they need someone who can confirm the testimony of the daily servant before them. Taliesin thinks over Eric's intent, and then says he gets it now. If the Emperor takes the witness first, he can twist the testimony and use it against them, and any testimony from their own vassals would be useless anyway. The lady turns to Ediule and asks who they can bring that the king's influence hasn't reached much. Ediule says he's not sure, but maybe the head of House Salakizi, a bastard who knows little about politics and has no power to oppose the king, but still has a respectable image. Eric listens, then orders a message sent at once. Later that day, he notices someone has arrived at the door, a red-haired man named Doidi Salakizi, bastard son of the former head of House Salakizi. He shakes Eric's hand and says it's a pleasure to meet him, but Eric stays silent, studying the noble in front of him. This man is the only member of the Salachiz family who survived the massacre the emperor arranged. The illegitimate son of the previous head born to a servant, he barely escaped the emperor's blade and lived hidden in secrecy until adulthood, when he finally went to the royal court to claim his title. Eric thanks him for coming so quickly. Doidi smiles and says he spends his days doing nothing but eating from morning to night. After hearing the situation, the red-haired man says it's an honor to be tied to the Cladnir family in this matter, then sips his tea with refined movements. Eric waits patiently for him to finish. Once he does, Doidi remarks that it's surprising the palace still hasn't responded when the princess was nearly hurt. They must be busy making a plan. Keeping that to himself, Eric calmly says they need to be cautious since this involves the two main families. Doidi says he understands now, so this isn't about the princess, but a simple love quarrel involving young Madame Cladnir. Eric corrects him at once. This isn't that, just a power struggle between families, and he must not have explained well if that's what Doidi understood. Nervously, Doidi apologizes and says he isn't well-mannered, so he chose his words poorly. Then he smiles, pleased with himself, and says he won't make that mistake next time. Eric thinks the nobleman is annoying, though he says he's relieved to hear it. Then the red-haired man suddenly cuts in to announce that the royal messenger has arrived. He asks for the messenger to enter the room. The palace has sent the captain of the guard, a man with a long scar, who doesn't even introduce himself before asking how the young lady is doing. He greets Eric, says she must have been deeply shocked by such a tragic event, and asks whether she was close to Madame Cladnir at the time of death or witnessed it herself. Eric thanks him for the concern and says his wife is fine, while carefully watching the captain's face. The man's expression seems genuinely worried. Somehow, he truly appears to care about the princess. Eric then introduces Duke Salachiz, saying that because this is such an important matter, he was called to testify. The man apologizes for not introducing himself sooner, saying he was too worried and gives his name Tilburg, the one responsible for the royal guard. After the greetings, Eric asks them to follow him to the second-floor room while briefly explaining the situation. Inside, guarded by Cullen and several knights, were the body of Maleka, the witness Eli Callan, and the servant of Ali. Seeing the maid's body, Doidi remarks that it's a frightening sight, while the Imperial Guard studies the scene with clear concern. He asks Eric where the young lady is and whether she truly is all right. Realizing how worried he seems about Misa, Eric replies that she is currently under her mother's care. Suddenly, the Imperial servant of Ali calls Captain Tilburg by name, greets him, and says she never expected things to end like this. Ali starts to say more, but Eric cuts in, saying he is going to introduce someone. He presents Gela and says she was assigned to help the young lady this time. The captain of the royal guard asks what family she comes from. Eric says she isn't from a noble house. She used to belong to the Order of Knights Cladnir, and he placed her here so she could give immediate treatment if his wife was hurt. Tilburg says that is reassuring. He then asks to begin by confirming Madame Maleka's body. Kneeling beside it, he starts his inspection and asks Eric whether the body is still in the same position as at the time of death. Eric says yes. Tilburg checks the bloody foam at her mouth and, catching the odor, says she seems to have died instantly. Eric adds that Gela was there and said the substance analysis would take 2 days. He knows the Imperial Palace will conduct its own investigation, but the captain cuts him off and says no. Once the results come out, just report that everything is fine. Surprised, Eric keeps his expression neutral and answers that everything is fine. The man examines the body again and notes that besides the instant death, her hands appear to have been tied, and her jaw is slightly swollen as if it had been broken. Eric says they tied her up for Misa's safety because they didn't know what she might do, and the jaw was damaged while forcing her to swallow something suspicious. He decides the truth is safer than an easy lie. Unexpectedly, Uncle Berrig seems to find that reasonable. Then the captain turns to Serva Dayard and asks her to explain what happened. She stays quiet a moment, then in a worried voice says she knows nothing, and that Madame Malek acted on her own, probably trusting in her husband's power or something like that. She goes on that she always knew Madame Malek would cause a major incident someday, judging by her usual behavior. She tampered with the princess's ornaments and stole silver cups from the palace of Cilia. Honestly, she was so ill-behaved, she should have been expelled back then. Djali adds that since arriving here, Malek had been in contact with the Marquis de Crispin. The last time, using the excuse of the lost canvas, the Marquis sent her servants, and she heard them say they had met in secret and planned something. They said the young woman in this house is now 18, so they had to finish the task within 2 years. Serva Djali says she's sure that's what they were discussing. Then she explains the red pigment, saying Malik somehow got hold of that horrible item and she had no idea, ending by saying she never imagined Malik was planning something so absurd. Uncle Berrig asks her to hand over the strange item for inspection, then asks why she suddenly tried to put makeup on the princess, the young lady. She answers that Master Eric and the princess seemed very close, always caring for each other and spending time together. When she and Madame Malik went to see the princess, even the room was so messy it embarrassed her to look at it. Djali says anyone can understand what that meant. Madame Malik took it as a good excuse, saying the princess couldn't afford to lose the attention she had finally received from her husband. After Doity flatters Eric and notices his look, he gives a short cough to draw the captain's attention, says the testimony is going well, and asks whether Uncle Berrig doesn't think it's only fair to hear what the maid Gala has to say too. Doity adds that she already seems to have quite a lot to say. Uncle Berrig agrees and decides to hear Gela's side of the story next. Following Eric's instructions, Gela recounts exactly what she witnessed, saying what she saw was a little different. She explains that the moment the captain broke down the bathroom door, he saw signs the young lady had resisted with all her strength, while Madame Daly held her from behind like she was being tied up. As Gala speaks, the maid grows increasingly anxious and says she was only following Madame Malek's orders. But Gala quickly cuts in, shaking her head and saying that's strange, because when the young master broke the door, Madame de Ali's face looked terrifying. To show the captain exactly what she saw, Gala asks Karen to help with the demonstration. He kneels and Gala twists his arms behind his back, holding him firmly, saying the young lady was like that, as if she were a condemned prisoner. Uncle Berrig's face hardens at Gala's final words. He declares there's no need to hear more and signals the men waiting outside to arrest Madame Diali immediately. The guards rush in and seize the maid as she screams that she's innocent. Dashali reaches toward Eric, begging him to help her, but the moment she looks at him, she realizes too late that Eric never explicitly promised her safety. A few hours earlier, he acted like he'd help her escape, but it was all a lie to trick her. As the guards drag her away, the maid screams that he's a liar who promised to help her escape if she told the truth. But her screams quickly faded into the distance. Once everyone was gone, Eric returned to the room where Misa slept on her mother's lap. Taliesin said the shock must have exhausted her, since she'd been asleep the whole time. After thanking his mother for watching over her, Eric lifted Misa into his arms. When she asked if everything was settled, he said almost Uncle Berrig had been rational, though oddly fixated on Misa's condition. His mother found that suspicious, said she'd look into it and warn him soon, then asked Eshali whether the second son of House Exelia served in the guard. Eshali said yes, though he wasn't on good terms with his family, so it might be better to approach the Conardy family instead. She finished by saying she'd find an excuse to contact them. Just then, a maid rushed in to announce that visitors had arrived and Eric asked who they were. She said they were servants from Marquis Crispin's house, insisting on seeing the young master despite the late hour. Since they wanted the meeting kept quiet, she'd place them in a waiting room. There were 2 of them, she added, and both seemed suspicious. One spoke far too rudely for a servant, while the other was wrapped in a cloak that hid the face completely. When Eric asked what they looked like, the maid said the rude one was obvious enough, and the cloaked one seemed a little too small to be a man. As soon as Eric entered, the pair fell silent. He cut straight in, saying he'd leave the moment his wife woke up, so Lacan and Crispin should get to the point. She admitted the visit was rude and thanked him for receiving her so late, but Eric stopped her again and told her to speak plainly. After a brief hesitation, head lowered in shame before her fiancé Lacan finally said she'd come to beg for mercy. She pulled back her hood without meeting Eric's eyes and confessed that her parents were greedy and incompetent. Even their talk of rebellion had nothing noble behind it. Her father was simply foolish, bitter that he never caught the Emperor's notice, and nursed a constant grudge because he felt overlooked. She said it all began when the Countess of Carlisle filled her mother's head with ideas, then asked whether Eric knew the Carlisle family. Eric dryly asked if she meant the same Carlisle who claimed to tremble at the mere sound of the Emperor's breath. Lacan said yes, the very same, and admitted that if they'd thought clearly, they would have realized this had been the Emperor's will from the start, but they got carried away and landed in this mess. When she finished, Eric said he appreciated her honesty and understood it hadn't been her intention, but Cladnir still had to answer for this. After all, they had tried to kill his wife. After a short silence, he added that otherwise he'd have no choice but to take the matter straight to the Emperor. The words terrified her. Lowering her head, she begged him not to speak of something so dreadful and asked what a mere daughter could possibly do. All she wanted was clemency. Eric asked whether the 2 families truly had no way to reconcile. Lacan considered it, then asked if he really thought her side still had any hand worth offering, saying she was almost disillusioned by his optimism. Seeing both their expressions, Eric knew there was no point pressing further, so he rose and said he had one last question. He asked whether she had anything to do with the guard at the border. She said no, she'd only become involved after that matter was already closed. Still, once she moved to the capital, she had appointed someone to watch her. Eric turned to the man standing beside Lacan and asked how capable the person she'd assigned to watch Misa was. When no answer came, he coolly added that it seemed the vice captain of the Knights Crispin wasn't on very good terms with his mother. The man lowered his head in apology, and Lacan quickly stepped in, promising they would investigate and report whatever they found. She then asked who they should contact. Eric said that for now he planned to treat this as nothing more than a petty power struggle among nobles and demand reasonable compensation. Then, with a hard stare, he added that he would also hold her responsible for any members of the Guidapaxia who tried to harm his people. Lacan lowered her head again and apologized for that as well. Suddenly, the door burst open. Margrave stormed in, furious that they could ignore each other over marriage, yet hold a secret meeting at this hour, calling the whole thing absurd. Eric turned back to Lacan and said that if her business was finished, she and her knight needed to leave now. She bowed, apologized once more for the imposition, then pulled her cloak back up and left with him, leaving an awkward silence behind. Eric asked his father why he'd taken so long to get there, but Margrave ignored that completely and demanded to know whether Eric had ruined the king's man over a woman who digs in gardens. Eric said it was impressive that he could twist the situation that way. Then the Count added that he'd also heard Eric had neglected his duties with the knights, handing Ambric the perfect chance to replace him. Eric had expected his father to dodge his own failings, but not with something this absurd, so he asked with open irony whether the same wasn't true of him. Margrave snapped, asking what he meant. Smiling, Eric asked if he hadn't also created the perfect opening for someone else to take over as head of the family. The Count's face hardened at once, and he mocked Eric as nothing but an insolent novice. Eric slowly stepped toward his father and asked whether he truly understood what was happening, whether he knew the Emperor was behind it all. Margrave froze and demanded to know what he meant. Eric raised his voice and laid it out. The woman he'd wasted money on back then, the marriage proposal with Crispin, every bit of it had been part of the Emperor's plan. As his father's face drained of color, Eric said they had all been chasing fantasies, dancing on strings the Emperor held like foolish puppets. While Margrave stood there stunned, Eric said he'd report everything to Cullen tomorrow and his father could hear the details from him. But the Count was still reeling, telling himself this had to be some kind of bad joke, so Eric asked whether he had at least apologized to his mother. Margrave raised his voice and demanded why he should apologize, saying there wasn't a man his age without one or two lovers. Eric knew his father wouldn't admit his faults easily, but even he hadn't expected something so ridiculous. He asked how his father saw his mother, whether he even recognized her as family at all. That wasn't the point, he said. Had he apologized for putting the family in danger, the apology he owed his legitimate wife? Eric remembered the father he'd admired as a child, flawless in his eyes, and thought that man had vanished long ago. As Margrave's hands began to tremble, Eric went on, mistakes born from incompetence could be forgiven, but deception and malice could not. That was what his father himself had taught him. Then Eric asked just how skilled a waitress's tongue had to be to reduce him to this. Margrave shot back that Eric could never understand, because he was always defending that foolish woman he called his wife, and never would in his entire life. The Count went on, saying he'd spent his whole life with a woman who despised every decision he made. His mother had been so perfect, so relentlessly perfect, that she mocked everything he did. How could Eric possibly understand that? Eric asked if that was really enough, if to escape his mother's mockery he had stabbed her in the back for the sake of some common woman. Struggling for breath, the Count couldn't find a response. Watching the man he once thought perfect, now reduced to this, filled Eric with such betrayal that even looking at him was hard to bear. As he passed by, Eric said that thanks to his mother, he had learned to respect intelligent women. Then, just before leaving, he added that thanks to his father, he had learned never to become a laughingstock in old age. Later that night, as he and Misa ate dinner, Eric asked whether the new room felt uncomfortable and told her to say so if anything was wrong. Misa still looked drowsy, even after sleeping all day, and only suddenly snapped awake when she heard Eric call her name. Misa apologized nervously and tried to remember what he'd asked, giving a small embarrassed laugh as she spoke. Eric asked again if everything was really all right. Misa answered calmly that the room was small, but comfortable. Eric took her arm and said he wasn't asking about the room. He wanted to know whether she still felt unwell, because her complexion didn't look good. Misa lowered her eyes and said she didn't know. Malika, who had tormented her, had died absurdly easily. When Misa first heard the news, she was almost thrilled, so much that she regretted not seeing Malika die in person, but that joy soon turned into fear. The death itself was disturbing, but what truly haunted her was that Malika had discovered her dangerous charm before she died. Somewhere along the way, Misa had become drunk on the sweet attention of the people of Cladmere. Maybe that excitement had made her lower her guard. In 12 years at the Imperial Palace, no one had suspected a thing, yet recently her secret had been exposed twice. That couldn't be coincidence or chance. Misa wondered whether it was really safe for things to keep going like this, whether it was all right for her to grow used to being treated like a human. She placed Eric's hand against her hair, wanting to feel its warmth, and said there were too many voices in her head now. She just wanted to erase those thoughts. Eric held her and whispered that everything was fine, and Misa found it strange how, the moment she felt his embrace, all those worries started to blur. His warmth and gentle touch slowly covered her mind, bringing the soothing sense that maybe there was no harm in enjoying it. Carrying Misa out to the porch, Eric said a little fresh air might help. He sat down on the terrace with her in his lap, and together they looked up at the night sky, where the stars shimmered faintly. Under that dim, sparkling sky, they stayed on the terrace in quiet air, with Misa resting in Eric's lap. Eric says the moon is bright tonight, and Misa stays quiet, admiring the stars while he rests his chin on her head. In a soft voice, he asks if her thoughts are still tangled. Misa says they are, and Eric tells her there's something she can try. It may sound childish, he admits, but maybe it'll help. So first he asks her to close her eyes first. Misa says she's fine, though she doesn't sound sure. With her eyes closed, Eric asks if she can see darkness. Misa says yes, and then he tells her to imagine all her thoughts filling that darkness and slowly gather them together. Misa asks how she's supposed to do that. Seeing her frown instead of imagining it, Eric can't help smiling. He touches the space between her brows and rubs it gently, saying not literally, just picture the thoughts coming together in her mind. Misa asks how many times she has to do it, and Eric says until they're all crumpled up. Then put them in a bag, just pretend you have one. He asks if she's done that, and Misa says yes. So now, he says, throw the bag somewhere it can't be seen. Then he asks if she feels a little better, but Misa only stares blankly before saying it's completely useless. In fact, gathering all her problems in one place just made everything feel worse. Eric looks away, trying to think of something else. He's never had to comfort someone this much before, and it leaves him oddly flustered. Thinking of another distraction, Eric mutters that constellation stories probably won't help, but Misa perks up and asks what he means. Noticing her curiosity, he tells her to look at the stars gathered in the sky. He points out one constellation shaped like a musical instrument, then another like a bird, and starts telling the stories tied to them. At first, Misa barely listened, but little by little she grew interested. The moment he paused, she quickly asked if there were more stories like that. Unfortunately, Eric had already run through everything he knew, so he says that's all for tonight and he'll think of more by tomorrow. Then she asks if they're going back inside now. Eric asks if she wants to stay out longer and watch the stars. She says yes, and he tells her she can stay as long as she wants. After a while, Eric asks if she knows Captain Tilburg of the Royal Guard. Misa says she's met him before, so he asks one more question. What kind of person is he? Misa thinks for a moment, then says he's a vicar. Eric, quite surprised, asks if that's all, but Misa isn't finished. She adds that besides being a vicar, he's also a traitor. Captain Tilburg's behavior yesterday had already surprised Eric, and hearing him called both a vicar and a traitor made him even harder to understand. Eric asks if she actually knows what a vicar is, and Misa answers that it's someone who tricks people to get what he wants. He says that's right, which only makes him more curious. Then Misa asks why he's asking, and Eric explains that Tilburg came yesterday to investigate. That immediately excites her. Smiling, she asks if Tilburg was really here. Eric says yes, but now he's confused. Why is she happy if she just called him a vicar and a traitor? Misa says he's a friend. Eric asks if she even knows what a friend is and why she'd call him that. Misa says they used to spend a lot of time together. Now genuinely uneasy, Eric asks what they used to do. She says Tilburg taught her many things, and he almost asks what exactly, but stops himself, realizing that approach won't get him anywhere. Trying to sort through it, Eric goes back to the word vicar and asks what Tilburg wanted and who he deceived. But Misa quickly changes the subject and asks if Tilburg will come back here. Eric presses her to answer, but Misa closes her mouth and turns away. That shocks him and only makes him more curious about why she avoids any question about Tilburg. She then says they already did that, didn't they? He is startled and asks her to wait. Has her attitude changed just because they consummated the marriage? And will she only talk if they do it again? Misa, caught off guard, asks if he means they have to do it again, if that's something people can do more than once. Eric, just as surprised, asks if she thought it only happened once. Misa, realizing it can happen again, quickly starts explaining that she really didn't say much today, almost nothing about Tilburg. Realizing his wife actually wants that again, Eric shakes his head and says he won't do anything tonight, because they had a long day, and she's obviously exhausted, so he has no intention of doing it now. Misa apologizes and admits she was just a little surprised. Then she lies down on Eric's lap, saying she really is tired and worn out. Her eyes are already heavy with sleep. Little by little, she drifts off. Eric watches her for a moment, wondering what she's hiding this time, then says they should go back to the room, while Misa's eyes reflect Eric's face but covered in blood, a sight she never wants to see. That night, Misa sleeps deeply in bed. Then her eyes slowly begin to open, and she calls for Eric, reaching out for him. When she can't feel him, she calls again, and suddenly sees him sitting silently at the edge of the bed. Misa asks what he's doing there and why he's awake in the middle of the night. She reaches toward him, asking why he won't look at her, but then she feels it. Something is wrong. Eric is motionless, his clothes soaked in blood, and he still says nothing. Misa panics and cries out, begging him to answer and look at her, when she suddenly wakes up gasping, clutching the sheets. She jerks upright, drained, telling herself it was only a nightmare, then turns at once to look for Eric. With trembling fingers, she reaches over to check if he's breathing. Once she confirms he is, she stares at him, and he stares back. As they keep looking at each other, one fear crushes her, that he might die and leave her alone. Misa thinks Eric can't just leave after being so good to her. He saved her today. If he hadn't appeared just then, Maleka would have exposed her lie at the Imperial Palace the moment she found out. And now that Misa thinks about it, he was always there whenever she was in trouble, always calming her whenever she was afraid. Until recently, Misa didn't care as long as this man lived quietly and caused no problems. But now she wants to live with him one more day, every day, and love him with all her heart forever. The next morning, the sun rises bright. In the room, Eric wakes first and asks if she slept well. Since he'd been up early, Misa says only a little. He says she should have woken him so she wouldn't be bored, but she replies that she wasn't bored. Then, after thinking for a moment, she softly admits that actually, yes, she was bored. Misa asks if she still can't go out today, and Eric says it's wiser to stay cautious for now. So she asks hopefully if she can at least walk around inside the house. He says his father is here, but as long as she stays still and behaves, it's fine. Just don't go to the east wing on the second floor, and if she meets his father, ignore anything he says. With a bright, effortless smile, Misa asks if that's really alright, and says it sounds exciting. Charmed by his beautiful wife, Eric asks if it really pleases her that much. He leans toward her lips and asks what's so fun about walking around. They're just about to kiss deeply, but Eric hesitates, remembering yesterday. Instead, he reaches out and gently strokes her hair, saying it's still early, and she should sleep a little more since she doesn't seem to have slept much. Misa touches a finger to her lips. She had wanted that kiss, but it doesn't happen. Then Eric asks if she wants breakfast this morning. Over the next few days, Misa keeps herself busy, constantly moving through the frozen mansion, as if something terrible might happen if she stopped even for a moment. Some people think she doesn't seem affected by the last incident, but Misa has always been active. And whenever she saw Eric, she ran to hug him, her smile always bright and natural. In his own way, Eric smiled back, even if others couldn't quite see it in his eyes. Completely worn out, Gela asks her young lady if she never gets tired. Misa says she doesn't, and that actually relieves her. She'd been worried she might be left alone too long. Mileka asks if everything is alright, but Misa is busy with something, when voices suddenly drift from another room in the mansion. They listen carefully and hear someone snap. You've lost your right to lead. Prepare for the 6th succession. I'll ask one more time, what part of that don't you understand? Mileka whispers that the voices belong to Count Margrave and Madame Taliesin. Realizing they've stumbled into a dangerous conversation, she grabs her head in both hands while the Count says he understands the anger, but it's absurd that his wife and son are conspiring behind his back. Della tries to pull Misa away, whispering that any noise will make them hear everything. But Misa doesn't budge, and Gela panics, thinking if they're discovered they will die, then quickly corrects herself through tears, saying only she is going to die. Giving up on moving Misa, Gela hurriedly hands her something to chew and begs her to stay silent, for the sake of her poor life. Will die, but she quickly corrects herself, and while she cries, says that only she is going to die. Giving up moving Misa, Gela quickly gives something to Misa and asks to chew in silence and to be quiet, begging that it is for the good of your mere employee here. Margrave assumes he was wrong and apologizes, swearing he'll never look at another woman again, but Thalisa tells him not to twist her words. It doesn't matter to her if he lives with that woman. In a soft voice, she says that instead she sees him as a good friend. He stayed faithful as her husband for years, and now it's time to free himself from the family's restrictions and find a little peace. The Count's hoarse voice bursts out. What does she mean by that? Is she trying to calm him by calling them friends? And is she saying she plans to take a lover too? Thalisa sighs, disappointed that this is all he cares about, and reminds him the king's eyes are on them, so he needs to do it soon. Margrave stiffens and asks if she's telling him to hand over the succession next spring after already discussing it with Eric and only now warning him like this, and whether she's forgotten how many years he gave to the family. In the next room, Gela can barely take it anymore and thinks she's losing her mind with all of this. She glances at the table, which seems to be asleep, but is only pretending. Thalisa asks whether Margrave, as head of the family, wants everyone to know how close he came to dragging them into danger. She says she's only telling him to control himself if he wants to spend his last years comfortably with that woman. Turning away, she says there's no reason to wait until next year. He should start preparing the succession immediately. She'll take responsibility for the woman and hide her on the estate. Then she ends the conversation and says goodbye. The Count's voice turns pleading as he asks Thalassa to wait. Deciding there was nothing else worth hearing, Nissa sat down and leaned against Gela. Gela told her to climb onto her back, then carefully carried Nissa down the long corridor while Thaliessa walked the other way, her footsteps drowned out by Count Margrave's desperate pleas. Gela's back was soaked with cold sweat, but somehow they escaped without being noticed by Mr. Margrave or Mrs. Thaliessa. Gasping, she thought that in just that short time she'd aged 10 years, and wondered what kind of room has no soundproofing. Still, she was relieved that luckily the little lady had stayed quiet. Gela greeted the maids they passed, but her mind kept spinning. Was it really okay to let this go when it seemed she'd accidentally overheard a family secret? Suddenly she snapped out of it and asked the maids whether they had spare clothes for the little lady, explaining that she'd gotten dirty while playing. One said she had just washed her dress and would bring it to her room later. The other asked if Gela knew what clothes the young lady wears during her menstruation period. Confused, Gela asked why, and they said that more than 6 months had passed, but the young lady had never once sent out any stained clothes from menstruation. The Imperial Palace staff used to handle that directly, but since they're gone now, the household thinks they should start taking care of it themselves. Later, Eric sat with Missa in his lap and asked Gela what was wrong, saying she looked like she wanted to say something. While Eric and Missa played together and smiled, Gela hesitantly began. After making sure the door was shut, she said she thought the little lady wasn't menstruating. Eric stared at her in shock, mouth slightly open, so Gela quickly clarified she didn't mean Missa was pregnant, only that her cycle seemed absent or irregular. Gela said she had served the lady for over 2 months and hadn't seen her menstruate once. Worried, she apologized and said it was an employee's duty to monitor these things, but the laundry staff said that for nearly 6 months they hadn't handled any related clothes even once. Gela added that, as a precaution, the staff had asked the Imperial Palace servants, but they only said they would handle it themselves, and refused to explain more. She doesn't believe those two would personally manage something like this, so something feels wrong. Regaining his composure, Eric said he didn't know much about this, and wanted to understand exactly what it meant for Misa's health. Gela hesitated, wondering if her words might make the captain treat the little lady coldly, but when she saw Eric studying Misa with real concern, she found the courage to go on. She said it could mean Misa may have trouble bearing in air. Of course, they would need to observe her more before being sure. Eric said he understood, then held Misa's hand and drifted into thought for a moment. Misa had no idea why the mood suddenly turned so heavy. She heard Eric ask what could cause a lack of menstruation, and Gela answered that poor nutrition could be one reason, one of the most common causes of irregular cycles. Misa wanted to ask what was going on, since they were clearly talking about her and she was the only one who didn't understand. Eric then asked what if that wasn't the case. Gela said there was another possibility, though she wasn't sure she should say it. After glancing around, she lowered her voice and said there was a rumor tied to the fallen grain incident, the one where he supposedly became infertile. Considering what the Imperial servants tried to do to the young lady before, Gela said she first assumed Misa's thin nails and pale skin came from malnutrition, but they might actually be the result of long-term poisoning. Seeing how plausible that sounded, Eric asked if there was any way to tell whether she had been drugged. Gela said the best way would be to ask the young lady directly, because they'd need to identify the poison, if there was one, to know whether it harmed only part of her body or weakened her overall health. Gela's frustration showed as she started speaking faster, adding that depending on the poison, there are foods she should avoid. When Misa suddenly opened her mouth and asked how serious it really was and whether it could be dangerous, Gela froze, then stared at Misa. Even after realizing the voice was hers, it took a second to understand what had happened. Then her legs gave out and she fell to the floor. Eric asked if she was all right. Misa speaking so suddenly had startled her. Misa said she didn't need to worry because she felt there was no problem with Gela knowing. Looking down at Gela, Eric said he wasn't entirely comfortable with that. People can let things slip without meaning to, and carelessness leads to leaks. Still, since his wife had already revealed it, there was no other choice. Eric stood up, irritated, and said it might be better to send someone from Cladnir to deal with Gela's family for now. Gela got even more frightened and let out a nervous laugh, asking what he planned to do. But Misa grabbed Eric's sleeve and begged him not to, saying Gela's sister Laura was about to get married soon. Gela reacted like she was angry the moment Misa mentioned her sister, but the talkative princess kept going. She told Eric that Laura has someone she truly likes, so please let her marry safely, and that her sister Tully had only just started working. Eric said he couldn't spare them for that alone, but Misa pressed on with an adorable plea, adding that she'd feel more at ease if Gela stayed here, and asked if he couldn't do that for his wife. Eric turned his face away, thinking there was no refusing her when she asked like that, and finally said everything was fine. Hearing that, Misa turned to Gela and told her to get hold of herself. She said Gela needed to recover quickly and prove to Eric that she could be trusted. With Misa pushing her, Gela finally managed to steady herself. Though barely, she still couldn't process everything that had happened and asked for a moment to calm down. Misa said that was fine, then danced and sang around Eric while reminding Gela to tell them when she was calm, because she still needed to explain what medicine she had taken. After all that chaos, Misa said that 3 days before the royal wedding, they gave her a thick brown liquid. Gela told her that described many medicines and asked if she remembered anything else. She moved closer, pressed on Misa's feet, and checked her skin while asking whether she'd felt numbness in her ears, darkness in her vision, or a burning pain in her hands and feet. Misa tried to remember and said she'd had stomach pain and that she had also taken sedatives, so Gela rubbed the upper part of Misa's abdomen and asked if it still hurt a little. Misa said yes and repeated that she had taken a lot of sedatives. Gela asked whether she had any bleeding. Misa didn't understand the term, so Gela explained, while Eric watched his wife with growing concern. He remembered their wedding night and realized that even if Misa had taken medicine, the amount of sedatives could have kept her from remembering what it was. He ground his teeth, trying to contain his anger. Just imagining what Misa went through made his blood boil with hatred. After hearing the explanation, Misa said she had rarely bled in her life, which left Gela a little confused. Then she stood and lowered her shoulders, admitting she honestly didn't know what medicine it was, but if allowed, she would like to take a small sample of the young lady's hair for analysis. Misa agreed at once and even asked if she could cut it herself, but Eric stopped her, saying that handling scissors carelessly can be dangerous. Gela then gave Eric a discreet signal. She would examine it, figure out the problem, and report directly to the commander. Eric nodded in agreement while Misa looked puzzled by Gela's gestures. So Gela carefully snipped off a little of Misa's shining blonde hair, said goodbye, and told them she'd see them later, tomorrow. The next day, Gela searched the Cladnir family library for anything on the medicine Misa might have taken, but she still couldn't even guess what it was, and none of her first theories seemed right. She started wondering if maybe nothing was wrong with the young lady's body at all, then thought she should ask the commander what Misa was like when she first arrived, since Gela wasn't there then. At least now, under the Cladnir family's care, Misa seemed healthy. At first glance, she looked quite well, and her skin was much better, but Gela knew that wasn't the whole story. Misa's legs still clearly troubled her. She couldn't walk properly, so Gela and Eric had to carry her most of the time. On top of that, her body still bore those awful scars, and even the maids had tried to do unspeakable things to her. Seeing those traces of the past, Gela hoped she was just overthinking. Misa seemed fine for now, with no serious symptoms, but what if it was some slow-acting poison? That question kept pounding in her head. She had left Misa with Mrs. Taliesa, then rushed off to get her, grumbling that she'd studied so long she lost track of time. In the living room, Mrs. Taliesa and the maids were caring for Misa as usual. Catching her breath, Gila looked over and saw Misa crouched beside the lady, recovering her breath. Misa was tugging on Taliesa's dress and chewing on the fabric. One look into those bright blue eyes left Gila speechless. Even yesterday she'd realized the little lady was genuinely doing well. She'd even seen her hold a coherent conversation with Eric. Beside the commander, Misa looked like a princess stepping out of a painting. Gila told herself twice to act natural, then awkwardly moved to a corner while watching her. She stopped beside a maid and kept repeating that she needed to act normal, but it clearly wasn't working because Mrs. Taliesa noticed the intrigued look Gela kept giving Misa. She asked why Gela was staring at her like that and whether something was wrong. Gela quickly said nothing was wrong, but Taliesa pressed, asking why she still had that expression. Gela scrambled to explain that she was only worried the little lady might be tired, but Mrs. Taliesa said she was just resting after playing for a long time. Then when Taliesa looked back, Misa had already disappeared. She was crawling toward Gela and holding out her arms. Startled, Gela asked if the young lady wanted to be carried. Misa immediately climbed onto her back and whispered so softly Gela could barely hear, telling her to go now. Though she almost missed it, Gela politely warned Mrs. Taliesa, who assumed the young lady was very sleepy. Taliesa told her to go ahead and take Misa upstairs to lie down, while Misa put on a smug little act the whole time. A new employee named Siata carefully watched Misa and Gela head up the stairs, then told Mrs. Taliesa that some letters had arrived today. Once they reached the room, Gela muttered that she was starting to feel a little regret, so Misa narrowed her eyes at her. Under that clear stare, Gela whispered and asked what she meant. Misa asked why she was acting so strangely, and Gela weakly replied that she'd been trying to act natural. Then Misa suddenly told her to put her down now, but Gela insisted on waiting a moment so she could place her in bed. Misa ignored her and ran off, making Gela panic that she'd fall, but then the young lady sat neatly by the bed and picked up a book. Gela blurted out how she was walking so well, saying she'd always seen her legs weak, but Misa just told her to speak more softly. Calmer now, Gela admitted she'd been curious for a while. Misa usually limped, but when Gela bathed her, no matter how closely she looked, she found no injury that could explain it. Misa said there was one, an injury on the back of her thigh. Gela asked if she meant the scars across her butt, adding that she walked like her muscles were torn or overstretched. Yet when Gela examined her, that kind of injury wasn't there. Misa's face turned worried, and she asked if Gela thought other people might notice it. Gela asked whether any doctor had treated her in the palace. Misa shook her head and said that would never have been possible, so Gela asked who had cared for her back then. When Misa said everyone who bathed her at that time was dead, Gela froze, then said she felt for those who died, but for Misa that was a stroke of luck. Misa lowered her eyes, shaken by the memory and suddenly insecure that someone had discovered it. Gela caught that expression and quickly knelt, taking Misa's hands and telling her not to worry. She eased the tension by saying that even if someone saw her now, they still wouldn't know, because some injuries leave no visible marks, and unless they'd treated many wounded soldiers like she had, they'd never figure it out. Then she asked if the commander hadn't noticed either. Misa said he didn't at first, but eventually he realized it, and she told him herself. That left Gela feeling awful. She apologized to the little lady, saying she hadn't understood the circumstances. Misa asked what she meant, and Gela admitted she'd said bad things about the commander without understanding what was really happening. Once she realized what Gela meant, Misa burst out laughing and repeated all the bad things Gela had said about Eric. She even copied Gela's exact tone and inflection, leaving Gela stunned, mouth open, ready to apologize. Gela begged her to forget it, then asked how she could remember it all so clearly. Misa ignored that and kept repeating every line she'd heard Gela say about Eric. Gela pleaded again for her to forget it. Misa only fell quiet because she was laughing, then changed the subject and asked whether Gela had figured out what kind of poison it was. Gela couldn't bring herself to admit she hadn't. Seeing the silence, Misa asked if that meant she still couldn't find out. Gela knelt and asked forgiveness, promising she would keep investigating. Then Misa thought for a moment and asked what Gela had meant when she said it might be hard for her to have an heir. Clearly uncomfortable, Gela hesitated, but Misa murmured that if it was so hard to say, she could just ask Eric. Gela quickly said it was better coming from her. She didn't want the commander explaining that. Then she steadied herself like the doctor she was, and told Misa it meant getting pregnant could be difficult. Misa asked why it was difficult and whether it was something embarrassing. Gela said not exactly, then explained that in a family like this, heirs matter a great deal. So if she can't have an heir, but she stopped there, wondering how the young lady would take the rest. Misa asked if that would weaken her position, and told Gela to finish what happens if she can't have an heir. So Gela admitted that in part, yes, normally it would. Then she said nothing else, thinking that was enough. Staring at the ceiling, Misa said she hadn't known that, then wondered when she'd ever had any position to begin with. The scene cuts to Eric, alone under pounding rain as a storm crashed around him and thunder split the sky. His mind was blank. He looked around, wondering where everyone had gone and what was happening, until voices started rising, asking about the barracks and the wounded soldiers. He kept turning, searching for the voices buzzing in his ear. Then he felt someone come up behind him and spun around in panic. A sword drove straight into Eric's throat. He screamed as blood spilled from his mouth. In the last seconds of his life, Eric tried to see who had attacked him, and when he caught that maniacal smile, his eyes widened. It was the Emperor himself. Eric jolted awake, drenched in sweat. He tried to sit up fast, then felt the soft blanket and let out a sigh of relief. After more than 10 years on the battlefield, nightmares were inevitable, Eric thought, rubbing his face. He looked out the window at the rainy night and wondered if the gloomy weather had made the dream feel so vivid and disturbing. When he turned his head, he saw Misa lying still beside him, fast asleep. He remembered her once saying she hated hot rainy days because they reminded her of losing her mother and everyone she loved. Thinking of that, Eric got up and decided to close the curtains tightly, figuring she'd sleep more peacefully that way. But even after closing them and trying to lie down again, a strange sense of discomfort kept bothering him. Eric looked back at Misa to check on her, and when he turned on the light, he finally saw her clearly. Misa was drenched in cold sweat, trembling hard and freezing. Eric immediately called Jella. After examining Misa, she said this looked like exhaustion. Maybe the young lady had been pushing herself too hard, but it was strange because she'd seemed perfectly fine all day. Eric let out a long sigh and said it might be because of the rain. Confused, Gela asked what he meant, and he explained that besides being afraid of birds, Misa also seemed to hate rain. He just hadn't realized it was this severe. Looking over Misa's pale face again, Gela tried to think of a way to block the sound of the rain. Then she asked Eric if he had any clean paper in the room. She tore a sheet into small pieces, dampened them, wrung out the moisture, and gently placed them in Misa's ears, saying paper blocks sound better than cotton. After Jelly treated her, Misa quickly began to calm down, but when she slowly opened her eyes and found herself somewhere unfamiliar, she saw her mother in front of her, calling to her soul. Misa could barely hear, but it sounded a little like her mother's voice, so she reached out with trembling hands, hoping to touch her again, but the one calling her name was Eric. She cupped his face, still believing it was her mother. Misa kept caressing him, sure she was touching her mother's face, until her senses returned and she realized it was Eric. Startled awake, she asked what happened, and he gently tried to calm her, asking if she was well enough to get up. He said she'd slept through the whole day, which worried him, then asked if she could hear his voice. Misa noticed her ears felt blocked, like something was stuck inside, and reached up to touch them, but Eric softly stopped her and asked her not to take them out yet. He explained it was still raining hard, so he'd remove them once the rain eased. Even with the muffled buzz, Misa could hear clearly, so she asked why there was something in her ears. Eric said it was because of the rain. She'd told him before that she hated it. First he tried closing the curtains to block the sound, but that didn't work, so with Jelly's help he tried wet paper instead. It sounded strange, but apparently it worked. Eric asked again how she felt. Misa said she was fine, even as her chest felt ready to burst. Thinking he'd stayed by her side the whole time just for her, Eric asked if she wanted something to eat, worried because it had been a while since her last meal, and decided to bring her a snack. He asked her to wait a moment while he got something for her to eat, but Misa grabbed his sleeve and pressed her face to Eric's broad back. Being with him made her heart feel warm and race. It reminded her of childhood in Palacelia, that small, tidy place where her mother always welcomed her with a warm smile, and the maids cared for her kindly. Everyone who met young Misa's eyes called her name and smiled brightly. She was truly loved, and she loved them all just as sincerely. But after one certain day, no one stayed by her side. Since then, Misa shut her eyes to everything that reminded her of childhood, and little by little, those beautiful days and reality split apart completely in her mind, so she lived as if watching her life from far away. She even liked acting bizarre, pretending to be crazy because it was fun, and didn't care if people pointed at her like a puppet on a polished stage. She believed this life was not hers. But now someone was looking at her with warm eyes and a gentle smile, even in this filthy, ugly reality. She clutched Eric's shirt tighter when he asked if she was okay. Misa lifted her head, looked at him with bright blue eyes, and slowly said, "Thank you very much for everything." Eric leaned closer, as if he couldn't trust his own ears, and Misa, still hesitant, thanked him again for treating her so well. Hearing that, Eric hugged her and said he never thought he'd live to hear those words from his wife. The rainy season came earlier than usual this year, but it also ended sooner than expected. For more than 2 weeks, Eric stayed by Misa's side, and little by little, the fear in her heart began to fade. Eventually, she no longer needed to cover her ears except during thunder and lightning, and once even plain rain no longer frightened her, she finally removed the paper from her ears. But then another problem appeared. Misa started quietly studying Eric's face, not just in the morning, but throughout the day. When he asked why she kept looking at him like that, Misa immediately turned away and said it was nothing. The truth was, she couldn't meet Eric's eyes. She couldn't believe a man like her husband really existed, a knight more wonderful than a fairy tale prince, treating someone like her and calling her family. Eric pressed that if she wouldn't tell him, he'd never know why she kept looking at him like that, but Misa still insisted it was nothing. Inside, she fought with herself not to look away at all costs, because admitting what she felt whenever she looked at him was far too embarrassing. Then Eric pulled her from her thoughts by placing a hand on her forehead. Gently lifting her head, he said his wife was acting strangely quiet and avoiding his eyes, so he asked her to look at him for a moment. He needed to check whether she had a fever. He said she felt very hot and asked if anything was bothering her. Red with embarrassment, Misa insisted everything was fine and he didn't need to worry. Eric wasn't convinced, so he said he had something important to tell her. Looking straight into Misa's eyes, he explained that a new palace maid was supposed to come greet her soon, and if she felt unwell, the schedule could be changed. The moment Misa met his eyes directly, she started to lose her composure. She tried to pull herself out of his arms but accidentally punched her husband in the face, while insisting that everything was perfectly fine with her. Realizing what she'd done, Misa froze with her mouth open in shock, and Eric could hardly believe what had just happened. Misa tried to explain but got so flustered no words came out, so instead she pretended to faint. The next day, Gela announced that the young lady's new clothes had arrived. They'd been ordered a while ago, but the rainy season delayed delivery until today. Gela cheerfully added that the shop owner said Eric had ordered them himself for the young lady. Hearing that, Misa answered in a flat tone and twisted her lips into an X, still remembering last night. But when Gela unpacked the clothes, her excitement slowly faded. She said they looked just like Missa's old clothes, and Misa explained she'd asked Eric to make them that way because they were more comfortable. Even so, still a little disappointed, Gela said she could at least have chosen better fabric. Then she held up a dress and explained that brighter colors would make Misa look even better. Misa changed the subject with a crossed expression and asked whether the boss hadn't mentioned that today's menu was soaked, saying he'd make sure to match it today. Misa laughed, and Gela asked what that was supposed to mean, admitting she could never understand the young lady. Then Misa looked away, thinking she hadn't really paid attention to him before, yet people always called Eric a war hero and an incomparably beautiful man. If Eric looked extraordinary to everyone else, then what did that make her? Misa wondered whether Eric, who had long since seen her true self, would still see her differently from everyone else after witnessing so much of her ugly, disgusting side. Gekla brought out more dresses, but Misa stayed lost in thought, wondering why she suddenly cared so much, and whether she wanted to be treated as more than just a person here. She remembered the day she asked Eric why he was being so kind to her, and he answered that she was part of the Cladnir family. That was why he was kind to her, simply because they were family. Even after spending their first night together, getting so close and sharing so much fun, they were still only that to him. What did she really want here? Noticing she seemed lost in thought, Gala said that if she was tired today, she could try on the clothes later. Misa agreed, while wondering why Eric hadn't been kissing her lately. What Misa actually wanted was for Eric to care about her, not just because they were family. She wanted him to hold her with feelings deeper than that. Before getting dressed, Misa went with Gela to play in the garden and lie on the grass. Misa said she'd read in a book that noble ladies do something called makeup, and asked whether Gela had ever tried makeup. Gela said no, she was too busy making a living, but asked why Misa was suddenly interested in makeup. Misa denied it twice to sound convincing, then changed the subject and asked why Gela was so busy making a living. Gela laughed awkwardly, noticing how fast she dodged the question, and said that for someone like her, that was normal. Some people even starved. Intrigued, Misa asked whether starving was common in this region, mentioning that Eric was always worried about food. Gela said it wasn't exactly common, but it was a long story. She explained that Cladnir was dry, so farming was difficult. If the harvest failed because of the climate, they had to buy food from other regions, and in recent years the long war had left almost no labor for agriculture. Misa lowered her head, so Gela explained further. Lately, the commander had been dealing with urgent food shortages, and even then, every year was still hard. Usually the previous harvest ran out around summer, so people had to survive until the next one. They ended up slaughtering their cows, pigs, and chickens too, but even that had its limits. Misa asked whether the yearly budget was too small. Gela said she didn't know about that. Then Misa said that as far as she knew, other regions paid taxes every year for the defense of the Northwest. Cladnir's estate received 80,000 jere, so she asked how many people lived there for that to be insufficient. Gela said she couldn't even picture such a huge amount. Casually counting on her fingers, Misa said it equaled the salary of the youngest sewing room worker for 208 years. Gela muttered that it was frightening, and Misa asked what she'd said. Gela explained she was only surprised, so Misa asked whether she looked strange. Gela said it wasn't strange at all. The young lady could do difficult calculations effortlessly, and her memory was far better than an ordinary person's. With open admiration, Gela said Misa wasn't strange at all. She was incredible and extraordinary. Caught off guard by the sudden praise, Misa asked again and again if Gela had really called her incredible, if that was really something not everyone could do. Misa leaned in and pointed at herself, asking if that was how Gela saw her. Gela said yes, she's very cool, and figured the young lady must enjoy praise, so Misa immediately asked if there was more. As Gela searched for compliments that wouldn't sound rude, the little princess realized she was getting way too excited and suddenly yelped that it was enough. She tried to play it off like she'd only been testing Gela, but now she knew Gela was a loyal girl, and now she was embarrassed. So Misa told her to stop saying nice things, even though she secretly wanted to hear more, while Gela just smiled at her blushing young lady. Then Misa suddenly remembered something and moved closer to ask about what Gela had done last time. Gela tilted her head, confused until Misa mentioned the hand gestures she'd used before. That made Gela remember it was sign language, and she explained that it was a set of signs only the Cladnir knights understood, which left Misa staring in disbelief. She started flailing her arms, saying she wanted to learn too. Gela agreed, but since she mostly works as a doctor, she only knows a few signs. Instead, she suggested the little lady learn from the commander, but Misa refused. She wanted it to be a little secret from Eric so she could surprise him. And that is the end for part 1. I hope you guys enjoyed this story. It's honestly one of my favorites too. I love how the female lead develops throughout the story, and the romance is just the sweetest, full of green flags. I want to bring you the full story as soon as I can, so please share with your friends, like the video a ton. I promise I'll bring the rest as fast as possible. Honestly, Eric is everything you want in a love interest. Patient, protective, and the way he slowly earned Misa's trust without ever forcing anything is just beautiful to watch. And Misa? She went through so much and still held on to this incredible strength just to survive. Watching her finally relax and let herself be genuinely happy is so rewarding to see. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought so far and which moment was your favorite. The story is called Beneath the Surviving Princess's Joyful Facade, and I've covered up to chapter 42. Kisses, and see you next time!